Quiet Chronicles welcomes you back wherever you're listening from tonight, under heavy blankets, in a dark room, on a train you wish would just keep going. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been living all day. Let your breathing slow to something closer to the rhythm this room deserves. And let the noise of the last 12 hours fall away piece by piece. Nothing here needs anything from you except your attention, and even that can drift when it wants to. At Deir el-Bahari, cut into limestone cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, there is a temple wall where a name was chiseled out on purpose. Someone came, decades after the fact, and scraped away every trace of a woman who had ruled Egypt not as a queen beside a king, but as a king herself. They wanted her forgotten. It nearly worked for over 3,000 years. If a gentle nudge in the algorithm's direction feels right, tapping subscribe helps this find other tired minds like yours, and sharing it with someone who needs a good long story to fall asleep to costs you nothing but a moment. For those who'd like to support what we build here more directly, there's a Patreon link waiting quietly in the description whenever you're curious. So let the chisel marks stay in the past for a moment, and let's go back to before anyone thought to erase her. Chapter 1: Daughter of a Warrior King. Egypt in the 16th century before the Common Era was a kingdom still testing the edges of its own confidence. The Hyksos had been driven out of the Delta only a generation earlier, and the pharaohs who followed spent their reigns proving that expulsion had not been a fluke. Thebes stood as the beating heart of this new assertiveness, its temples rising along the Nile as monuments to a dynasty determined to be remembered. Into this atmosphere of restless ambition, a king named Thutmose the Fierce took the throne, and he did not intend to rule quietly. Thutmose I was not born to the throne in any simple sense. His own claim ran through a marriage rather than an unbroken bloodline. He compensated for that uncertain pedigree with sheer aggression on the battlefield. His armies pushed south into Nubia with a violence that later scribes remembered vividly, and they pushed north into the Levant, further than any Egyptian king had gone before him. He returned from these campaigns not just victorious, but transformed in the eyes of his court, a living demonstration that the throne could be secured by will as much as by birth. At home, Thutmose I built as fiercely as he fought. He expanded the Temple of Amun at Karnak, adding pylons and obelisks that announced his reign in granite. This was not incidental decoration. Every stone he raised was an argument for legitimacy, a way of writing his name permanently into the record of the God he claimed had chosen him. His court understood the message clearly, and so did the priesthood whose favor he needed to keep. The king's household was crowded, as royal households of the period tended to be. His principal wife was a woman named Ahmose, and it was through her that his most legitimate children came. Ahmose herself carried the title of Great Royal Wife, a position that placed her at the center of dynastic politics, whether she sought that role or not. There was also a secondary wife, Mutnefret, whose sons would matter enormously to the story that followed. Between these two women, the fate of the dynasty's next generation was already being quietly decided. Ahmose bore Thutmose I several children, and not all of them survived. 2 sons, Amenmose and Wajmose are recorded in inscriptions from the period, and both appear to have died before their father did. This was not unusual for the era. Infant and childhood mortality struck royal families with the same indifference it showed everyone else, regardless of the wealth or divinity surrounding a birth. What made this particular loss significant was what it left behind: a succession with no obvious male heir from the marriage that mattered most. It was into this uncertain arithmetic of survival that Hatshepsut was born, likely around 1507 BCE. She came into the world as the daughter of Ahmose and Thutmose III, which meant she carried the most legitimate bloodline available in the palace. Her birth was recorded with the kind of attention reserved for royal children whose parentage needed no defending. From her earliest days, she held the title of King's Daughter, a designation that came with real weight in 18th Dynasty Egypt, not merely ceremonial politeness. Royal daughters in this period were far from decorative. They held religious offices, controlled estates, and often served as visible extensions of their father's authority throughout the kingdom. Hatshepsut would eventually carry the title God's Wife of Ammon, one of the most powerful religious positions a woman could hold in Thebes. This was not a future she stumbled into by accident. It was, in many ways, the natural continuation of the status she was born with. Life inside the royal palace at Thebes moved to rhythms that outsiders rarely saw. Children of the king were educated by scribes and priests, taught to read and write in a script that most of Egypt's population never touched. Hatshepsut would have learned the formal hieroglyphic script used in temple inscriptions, along with the more practical hieratic script used for everyday administration. She would have also absorbed, simply by proximity, the rituals and protocols that structured court life, from sunrise prayers to the seasonal festivals of Amun. The palace itself was less a single building than a small city of its own, filled with attendants, priests, guards, and the extended family of a king who took his position seriously. Hatshepsut grew up surrounded by evidence of her father's military triumphs, since captured goods and foreign tribute regularly arrived at Thebes as proof of victory abroad. She would have heard, even as a small child, the accounts of Nubian campaigns recited by soldiers and officials eager to please the king. This was the ordinary texture of her early years. Power was not an abstract concept to her. It was the smell of incense during temple rites and the sight of foreign captives paraded through the city. Mutnefret, the king's secondary wife, had also produced sons, and one of them would prove decisive to the family's future. This son, also named Thutmose, did not carry Hatshepsut's superior maternal lineage. His mother was not the great royal wife, and by the standards of the era, that mattered a great deal in questions of succession. Still, with Ahmose's sons dead in childhood, this half-brother's existence was the only thing standing between the dynasty and a succession crisis. Thutmose, I understood the fragility of what he had built. He had spent years fighting to expand Egypt's borders and years more building temples to secure divine favor, and none of it meant much if the throne collapsed into chaos after his death. Marriages between royal siblings were not unusual in this period, precisely because they solved problems like this one. A union between Hatshepsut, the daughter of unimpeachable royal blood, and her half-brother, the only surviving son, offered a tidy solution to an untidy problem. There is no surviving record of how young Hatshepsut felt about the arrangements being made around her future, and it would be a mistake to imagine she had much say in them regardless. Royal children, daughters especially, existed within a web of dynastic necessity that placed the kingdom's stability above individual preference. What we do know is that she was raised with an unmistakable awareness of her own importance. Inscriptions from later in her life reference her royal parentage with a pride that suggests it was instilled early, not adopted only once she needed it politically. Thutmose II's reign did not last indefinitely, though it left a permanent mark on Egypt's landscape and self-image. His military campaigns had pushed the kingdom's reach further than it had gone in generations, and his building projects had reshaped Karnak into something grander than his predecessors had imagined. By the time his health began to fail, the question of who would carry this legacy forward had become urgent. The answer, however, was not going to be simple. Egyptian succession in this era followed no rigid mechanical rule, despite the appearance of orderly transitions in official records. Legitimacy was built from a combination of bloodline, marriage, religious endorsement, and sheer political maneuvering, often assembled after the fact to justify whoever ended up holding power. Hatshepsut's position gave her considerable leverage in this equation, even as a young woman who would never sit on the throne in her own right during her father's lifetime. Her half-brother needed her, in a sense, more than she needed him. That imbalance would echo forward through the rest of her life. The court around Thutmose was not a passive audience to these dynastic calculations. Priests of Amun, military officials who had served in the Nubian and Levantine campaigns, and administrators who ran the machinery of the kingdom, all had stakes in how the succession played out. A smooth transition served everyone's interests, since instability threatened the trade routes, tax collection, and religious calendar that kept Egypt functioning. Hatshepsut, still a child or young girl during much of this maneuvering, was nonetheless a piece on a board that adults were actively playing. What set Hatshepsut apart from other royal daughters of her generation was not any single event of her childhood, since the record here is thin and mostly inferential. It was instead the accumulation of small advantages, unimpeachable maternal lineage, proximity to religious authority through her expected priestly titles, and a father whose reign had given the entire family an aura of divine favor. These advantages did not guarantee her a throne. Nothing in Egyptian tradition promised a woman that outcome, however capable she might prove to be. Still, the foundation was being laid, stone by stone, in ways no one around her could have fully anticipated. Thutmose I had built temples meant to outlast him, and without quite intending it, he had also built a daughter whose sense of her own legitimacy would outlast every expectation placed on her. She was, at this point, simply a king's daughter navigating a court, preparing for her father's death. The woman who would later call herself king had not yet emerged. But the raw material for that transformation, the bloodline, the education, the proximity to power, was already firmly in place. Chapter 2: The Throne's Narrow Path. Thutmose I died after a reign that had reshaped Egypt's borders and its skyline alike, and the machinery of succession began turning almost immediately. Death in the royal house was never a private matter. It triggered rituals of mourning, embalming, and burial that stretched across many weeks, all while decisions about the future were being made behind closed doors. The kingdom could not simply pause while priests debated legitimacy. Someone needed to sit on the Horus throne, and the court had already narrowed its options considerably. The son of Mutnefret, bearing his father's name of Thutmose, was the only viable male heir left standing. His claim was not as clean as it might have been. His mother lacked the elevated status of Amos, and in a court obsessed with proper lineage, that distinction mattered enormously to the officials weighing his fitness to rule. Yet the alternative was no heir at all, and Egyptian tradition abhorred nothing more than an empty throne. Practicality, as it often does in politics, overruled purity of bloodline. To smooth over the weakness in his claim, a marriage was arranged between this young Thutmose and his half-sister Hatshepsut. She brought exactly what he lacked, an unimpeachable connection to Amos, and through her, the fullest possible legitimacy the royal family could offer. This kind of sibling marriage was not shocking within the 18th Dynasty. It served a specific and recurring political function, binding together bloodlines that otherwise threatened to fracture the succession. Hatshepsut, likely still in her early teenage years, became great royal wife almost as a matter of dynastic engineering rather than personal choice. Thutmose II ascended the throne carrying a name meant to invoke his father's military triumphs, though his own reign would look nothing like that comparison suggested. Surviving records paint him as a less commanding figure than his predecessor, with fewer campaigns and a noticeably shorter list of accomplishments. Some later historians have wondered whether ill health limited what he could achieve as king. His mummy, discovered centuries afterward, showed signs of skin disease and a body that had not aged well even by ancient standards. Whatever the cause, his reign carried none of the thunderous confidence that had defined his father's decades on the throne. Court life did not stop simply because the king at its center was less dynamic than his predecessor. Administrators kept collecting taxes along the Nile. Priests kept the temple calendars turning with their endless cycle of offerings and festivals, and the machinery of the state continued largely on inertia built by Thutmose I. Hatshepsut, now great royal wife, held a position of genuine influence within this apparatus. The title was not ceremonial window dressing. It came with estates, religious duties, and a visible role in public ritual that placed her constantly before the eyes of the court and the priesthood alike. One campaign attributed to Thutmose II's reign involved suppressing unrest in Nubia, a region that had a habit of testing Egyptian authority whenever a new king seemed uncertain on the throne. Inscriptions describe brutal reprisals against rebellious populations there, continuing a pattern of harsh southern policy that Thutmose I had established. There is also record of a smaller action against Bedouin groups in the Sinai region. These campaigns, whether personally led by the king or directed through his generals, suggest that Egypt's military machine kept functioning even under a less imposing ruler. The apparatus built by his father did not require a warrior of the same caliber to keep grinding forward. Hatshepsut's role during these years extended well beyond the domestic sphere that might be assumed for a royal wife of the period. She held the title God's Wife of Ammon, a religious office of enormous significance in Thebes. This position placed her at the center of temple ritual, participating directly in ceremonies dedicated to Egypt's chief god. The office also came with its own estates and personnel, effectively giving her an independent power base separate from her husband's authority. Few women in Egyptian history had held this combination of religious and dynastic power simultaneously, and she wielded both with evident comfort. It was during this marriage that Hatshepsut gave birth to a daughter, Neferur, who would become a significant figure in the years that followed. Neferur's birth mattered enormously to the dynasty's continuity, since any child of Hatshepsut and Thutmose II carried the strongest possible claim to future succession. She would later be trained for religious office herself, groomed from a young age for a role near the center of Theban ritual life. Her presence in later inscriptions, standing close to her mother, hints at just how central she became to Hatshepsut's public identity as queen. What Thutmose II and Hatshepsut did not produce together, however, was a son. This absence would prove decisive for everything that came afterward. Royal succession depended overwhelmingly on male heirs, and without one from his primary marriage, the king's line faced the same fragile arithmetic that had troubled his own father before him. It was a problem that history seemed determined to repeat within this family, generation after generation, regardless of how carefully marriages were arranged to prevent it. The solution came, as it often did in this dynasty, through a secondary wife. A woman named Isis, of considerably lower status than Hatshepsut, bore Thutmose II a son. This child was given the name Thutmose as well, continuing a naming pattern that can make the dynasty's history genuinely confusing to follow centuries later. Unlike Hatshepsut, Isis held no grand title suggesting elite birth, and later Egyptological reconstructions have debated her exact background at length. What mattered immediately, though, was simple. The king finally had a son. This son's claim to the throne was, if anything, weaker than his father's had been. His mother lacked royal blood of any significant standing, and Hatshepsut, still very much alive and influential, remained the clear superior in lineage and status within the palace. Yet by this point in the dynasty's development, a male heir of any legitimate parentage was treated as preferable to the alternative of no heir whatsoever. The court had learned this lesson twice already. It was not eager to relearn it a third time through open crisis. Thutmose II's reign, by most reconstructions, lasted somewhere between 3 and 13 years, with considerable scholarly disagreement over the precise length. Ancient Egyptian chronology from this period relies on fragmentary king lists, astronomical calculations, and cross-references with other civilizations, none of which align perfectly. What is clearer is that his reign, however long it ran, ended with him still relatively young. His body, when later examined, showed the marks of someone who had not lived an especially long or robust life, consistent with the health troubles hinted at in other evidence. His death left the throne once again in a precarious position, though this time the shape of the crisis was different from what had come before. There was a male heir this time, unlike the situation Thutmose I had faced. But that heir, the son of Isis, was still a young child, likely no older than a toddler when his father died. A child could not lead armies, oversee temple construction, or manage the daily business of running a kingdom stretching from Nubia to the Levant. Egyptian tradition had mechanisms for exactly this kind of problem. When a king died, leaving an heir too young to rule, a regent was appointed to govern in the child's name until he came of age. This was not an unusual arrangement in the ancient world generally, and Egypt had precedent for it within its own history. The question was who would fill that role for the son of Isis, given the delicate politics surrounding his birth and his mother's comparatively modest status. The obvious answer, at least to the court officials weighing the options, was Hatshepsut herself. She was the child's aunt by blood, since her father was also Thutmose I, and his stepmother by marriage, since she had been his father's great royal wife. Her status within the palace was unmatched by any other candidate available. No one else combined her royal bloodline, her religious authority as God's wife of Amun, and her established presence at the center of Theban political life. There is no indication that Hatshepsut had spent years plotting for exactly this moment, waiting for circumstances to hand her power. The evidence instead suggests a woman whose position had simply accumulated advantage after advantage through a series of deaths and dynastic misfortunes that were largely beyond her control. She had not chosen to be born the daughter of unimpeachable blood. She had not chosen her husband's early death, nor the fact that his only son was a small child unable to govern. What she had done was occupy every role available to her with evident capability, and now those roles were converging towards something far larger than anyone might have predicted for a king's daughter born decades earlier. As Thutmose II was carried to his tomb and the mourning rituals ran their course through the city of Thebes, the court quietly turned its attention toward the next chapter of the dynasty's uncertain story. A child sat, at least in name, upon the throne of Egypt. But the real question, the one occupying the minds of priests, generals, and administrators alike, concerned the woman standing beside that throne. Nobody yet knew how far her influence would ultimately reach. They were about to find out. Chapter 3: The Boy King and the Regent. Thebes settled into an uneasy calm once the burial rites for Thutmose II concluded, the kind of calm that follows a transition nobody fully trusts yet. A child now held the title of king, a boy whose mother carried no great lineage and whose age made him incapable of governing anything more complex than his own daily routine. Egypt, meanwhile, did not pause its business for anyone's uncertainty. Grain still needed collecting along the Nile, and temples still required their endless cycle of offerings. Someone had to stand at the center of that machinery while the boy grew, and every eye in the palace turned toward the same person. The young king took the name Thutmose III, continuing the family's habit of recycling names across generations in ways that still frustrate historians today. His mother Isis held no formal role in governance beyond her connection to the child himself. She lacked both the religious standing and the political relationships needed to run a kingdom stretching across 2 continents. Whatever affection she may have held for her son, the machinery of the Egyptian state required something she simply could not provide. That gap was where Hatshepsut stepped forward. Her appointment as regent followed established Egyptian precedent rather than representing any radical break from tradition. Widowed queens or close female relatives had served in this capacity before, guiding the kingdom until a young king matured enough to rule directly. Hatshepsut's credentials for the role were, by any measure, exceptional. She held the title of God's wife of Amun. She had served as great royal wife to the previous king, and her bloodline traced directly back to Thutmose I, without any of the complications surrounding her nephew's parentage. Early inscriptions from this period show her functioning exactly as regents were expected to function. She appears in reliefs standing slightly behind the young king, present but positioned as a supporting figure rather than the central authority. Her name and titles accompany his in official documents, acknowledging her role without yet claiming equal status. This was the accepted shape of regency in Egyptian tradition, and for a time, Hatshepsut occupied it without apparent controversy. Administering Egypt was no small undertaking, even with an established bureaucracy inherited from previous reigns. Taxes needed assessing across the agriculture land bordering the Nile, a process tied intimately to the annual flood and its unpredictable generosity. Temple estates required oversight, since religious institutions controlled enormous wealth and labor throughout the kingdom. Trade relationships with regions like Nubia, the Levant, and Punt demanded continued attention, or Egypt risked losing the economic advantages built up over previous generations. Hatshepsut inherited all of this the moment she assumed her regency, whether or not she had spent years preparing for such responsibility. She surrounded herself with officials whose competence mattered more in practical terms than their personal loyalty to any single faction within the court. Some of these men had served under Thutmose the Fierce and Thutmose II already, carrying institutional memory that proved valuable during a transition this delicate. Others rose specifically during her regency, owing their positions and advancement directly to her patronage. This pattern of building a loyal administrative core would only deepen as her authority expanded in the years ahead. Among the officials who began gaining prominence during this period was a man named Senenmut, whose background offered little hint of the influence he would eventually wield. He came from a family of no particular distinction, without the pedigree that typically opened doors within Egypt's rigid court hierarchy. Yet he possessed administrative talent that caught Hatshepsut's attention early, and he was given responsibilities that steadily expanded in scope. His full significance to her reign would only become clear later. For now, he was simply one capable official among several serving a regent still operating within traditional bounds. The young Thutmose III, meanwhile, grew up largely removed from the daily business of governing the kingdom that technically belonged to him. Royal children of this era were raised within the palace under careful supervision, educated in both practical administration and religious ritual appropriate to their expected future role. There is reason to believe he received military training relatively early, a detail that later proved significant given the formidable general he eventually became. But during these childhood years, actual power remained firmly in Hatshepsut's hands, exercised through an apparatus she increasingly shaped according to her own judgment. Temple construction continued during this period, following patterns established by previous kings eager to demonstrate piety and secure divine favor. Hatshepsut involved herself directly in these projects, a role that queens and regents before her had occasionally taken, but rarely with this degree of personal investment. Building projects served multiple purposes simultaneously. They honored the gods, provided employment for laborers and artisans across the kingdom, and permanently inscribed a ruler's name into Egypt's physical landscape for anyone willing to read. It was likely during these years that inscriptions began subtly shifting in how they described Hatshepsut's role. Some texts started attributing to her language and honors that exceeded typical regency conventions, even while Thutmose III remained the nominal king in official documents. Historians studying this period debate exactly when this shift accelerated and what it signaled about her intentions. What seems clear is that a gradual process was underway, one that would eventually transform her position entirely. The priesthood of Amun, centered at Karnak, represented one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt during this era, controlling vast estates and enormous religious authority. Hatshepsut's relationship with this priesthood mattered enormously to her ability to govern effectively, since religious endorsement carried weight that mere political appointment could not replicate. Her position as God's wife of Amun already gave her unusual standing within this institution, standing that few regents before her had possessed. This connection would prove essential to legitimizing whatever came next in her political evolution. Nubia, always a region requiring careful management, seems to have remained largely stable during the early years of the regency. Military garrisons established under previous kings continued functioning, and trade routes bringing gold and other valuable resources northward stayed open. This stability mattered enormously for a regency still finding its footing, since a major military crisis would have tested Hatshepsut's authority in ways she was not yet positioned to handle. The relative calm of these years gave her space to consolidate control gradually rather than through crisis management. Court factions inevitably existed beneath the surface calm of official inscriptions, as they did in any complex bureaucracy managing competing interests. Some officials likely harbored reservations about a woman exercising this degree of authority, regardless of her impeccable bloodline and established titles. Egyptian tradition, while it permitted powerful women in religious and even political roles, had no clear precedent for what Hatshepsut appeared to be moving toward. Whether these reservations translated into active resistance during this early period remains difficult to determine from surviving evidence, since inscriptions rarely recorded dissent against a ruling regent. Hatshepsut's daughter Neferur occupied an increasingly visible position during these years, appearing alongside her mother in inscriptions and beginning to take on religious titles herself. This mattered for reasons beyond simple maternal pride. Neferur represented continuity, a living connection between Hatshepsut's own unimpeachable lineage and whatever future the dynasty was building. Her early training for religious office suggested that Hatshepsut was already thinking carefully about how power and legitimacy would be transmitted across generations, not merely how to manage the present regency. The precise timeline of Hatshepsut's transformation from regent to something considerably grander remains a subject of ongoing scholarly reconstruction, pieced together from fragmentary inscriptions and shifting titulary across different monuments. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that this transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through incremental adjustments to how she was depicted, titled, and referenced in official contexts. Each small shift tested the waters slightly further than the last, without provoking the kind of open crisis that might have derailed the entire process. By the later years of this regency period, something had clearly changed in how Hatshepsut positioned herself relative to the young king she nominally served. She was no longer simply a supporting figure standing behind the throne in temple reliefs. She was becoming something the Egyptian political tradition had never quite formalized, a woman exercising the practical authority of kingship, while the actual king remained a child growing up in her shadow. The court had accepted a regency without much apparent friction. What came next would test that acceptance far more severely. Chapter 4: The Turn. Regency, by its very design, was meant to be temporary. Egyptian tradition understood it as a bridge between a father's death and a son's maturity, a role to be occupied and then relinquished once the young king could rule in his own right. Hatshepsut had filled that bridge role capably for years, managing the machinery of the state, while Thutmose III grew from infancy toward the edges of adolescence. But bridges, once built strongly enough, sometimes stop functioning as mere passageways. Something in the structure of her authority had begun to change, and it was changing in ways that would eventually redefine what her position actually meant. The shift did not announce itself through any single dramatic proclamation. Egyptian political transformations of this magnitude rarely worked that way, favoring instead a slow accumulation of small adjustments that only became visible in hindsight. Inscriptions from this period show subtle alterations in her titulary, small additions and modifications that pushed her language closer to that used for a reigning king rather than a supporting regent. Each change was modest on its own. Together, they traced the outline of something far larger taking shape. Her relationship with the priesthood of Amun at Karnak proved essential to whatever transformation she was pursuing. This institution controlled not just religious ritual, but enormous economic resources, and its endorsement carried weight that no amount of military force could substitute for. Hatshepsut had spent years cultivating this relationship through her position as God's wife of Amun, participating directly in temple ceremonies that few political figures could access so intimately. That groundwork was now paying dividends, as key figures within the priesthood appear to have supported her growing claims to authority. One of the officials most central to this period was Senenmut, whose responsibilities had expanded considerably since his earlier days managing more modest administrative tasks. He now held significant authority over royal building projects and estates, positioning him at the intersection of religious, economic, and architectural power within the kingdom. His loyalty to Hatshepsut appears to have been absolute, and his competence gave her a reliable instrument for executing whatever ambitions she was beginning to pursue. Few officials in Egyptian history rose so far from such modest origins, and fewer still attached their fortunes so completely to a single patron. Court support for Hatshepsut's expanding role was not universal, though surviving evidence makes it difficult to reconstruct the precise contours of any resistance. Egyptian inscriptions rarely preserve dissenting voices, since monuments were commissioned by the powerful to celebrate their own achievements rather than record opposition to them. Still, the very novelty of what Hatshepsut was attempting suggests that not everyone within the court found it easy to accept. A woman moving from regent towards something resembling full kingship had no clean precedent in Egyptian history. Whatever objections existed, they did not prove strong enough to halt her momentum. Military officials represented another crucial constituency whose support mattered enormously during this transitional period. Egypt's army had been built into a formidable institution under Thutmose I, and its officer corps carried considerable influence within the broader political structure. Hatshepsut needed these men either supportive or at least neutral toward her growing authority, since active military opposition could have ended her ambitions swiftly and violently. The relative absence of recorded conflict during this period suggests she managed to secure, at minimum, their acquiescence. Somewhere in this gradual process, Hatshepsut began appearing in artistic representations with elements traditionally reserved for kings rather than queens or regents. Early examples show tentative experimentation, a slight shift in regalia here, a modified title there. These were not yet the full transformation that would eventually characterize her mature reign, when she would be depicted with the false beard and other symbols of pharaonic authority. But the direction of travel was becoming unmistakable to anyone paying close attention to Theban monuments during these years. Thutmose III, meanwhile, continued growing older within a court structure that increasingly centered on his aunt rather than himself. There is no surviving record of his personal feelings about this arrangement, and speculation about his private thoughts risks projecting modern assumptions onto evidence that simply does not exist. What can be observed is that he continued receiving whatever education and training befitted a future king, including the military preparation that would later make him one of history's most accomplished commanders. His formal titles remained intact even as practical authority concentrated elsewhere. The timing of Hatshepsut's full assumption of kingship, conventionally placed around the 7th year of the joint reign, has generated substantial scholarly debate over the decades. Some historians point to specific inscriptions suggesting a triggering event, perhaps a crisis of legitimacy that required decisive action to resolve. Others argue for a more organic process, one without any single catalyzing moment, in which accumulated precedent simply reached a tipping point. The fragmentary nature of surviving evidence makes certainty elusive, though the broad trajectory remains clear regardless of which reconstruction proves more accurate. Whatever the precise mechanism, Hatshepsut eventually took the unprecedented step of assuming full royal titulary, including a throne name that placed her formally among Egypt's kings. This was not a symbolic gesture confined to religious contexts alone. It represented a fundamental reordering of political reality, one that required active cooperation from priests, officials, and military commanders who could have resisted had they chosen to. Their acceptance, whether enthusiastic or merely pragmatic, made her transformation possible in ways that raw ambition alone never could have achieved. Artistic conventions shifted correspondingly once this transition solidified. Hatshepsut began appearing in the full regalia of Egyptian kingship, including the ceremonial false beard that symbolized pharaonic authority regardless of the wearer's actual gender. This was not an attempt to disguise her womanhood, as later interpretations sometimes suggested. Egyptian art operated according to conventions of office rather than strict anatomical accuracy, and the symbols of kingship carried meaning independent of the individual body wearing them. Thutmose III did not disappear from official records during this transformation, a detail that distinguishes Hatshepsut's rise from a simple usurpation or coup. He continued to be acknowledged as king alongside her, his name appearing in inscriptions and his image included in temple reliefs throughout this period. The relationship between the two rulers is often described by historians as a co-regency, though the exact balance of power within that arrangement clearly favored Hatshepsut for most of its duration. This coexistence, unusual as it was, seems to have functioned without the kind of open conflict that might otherwise have destabilized the kingdom. The mechanics of daily governance did not change dramatically once Hatshepsut assumed formal kingship, since she had already been exercising practical authority for years beforehand. What changed was the language surrounding that authority, the way inscriptions described her role, and the symbols associated with her public image. Administrators continued their work largely as before, and the bureaucratic apparatus inherited from previous reigns kept functioning without significant disruption. In this sense, her assumption of kingship formalized an existing reality more than it created an entirely new one. Religious justification for this transformation would need to be more elaborate than mere political maneuvering could provide, given how thoroughly it broke with tradition. Egyptian kingship carried deep theological significance, tying the ruler directly to the gods and to Egypt's cosmic order. A woman claiming this role needed more than administrative competence and priestly cooperation to secure lasting legitimacy. She needed a story, one that placed her ascension within the framework of divine will rather than mere human ambition. That story would take shape in the years immediately following her assumption of kingship, developed with the same careful attention to detail that characterized every other aspect of her political rise. It would eventually be inscribed permanently into the walls of one of Egypt's most remarkable temples, a narrative claiming nothing less than divine parentage for the woman now ruling as king. This was not improvisation born of desperation. It was the deliberate construction of legitimacy on a scale that few rulers before or after her would attempt with such thoroughness. By the time this transformation had fully settled into place, Hatshepsut stood in a position without real precedent in Egyptian history. She was not a queen ruling through a husband's authority, nor a regent governing temporarily on behalf of a child. She was, by every formal measure the Egyptian state could produce, a king. The court had accepted this reality. The priesthood had endorsed it, and the machinery of government continued functioning under her direction. What remained was to explain, in terms the entire kingdom could accept, exactly how a daughter of Thutmose IV had become something no daughter of any king had quite become before her. Chapter 5, born of a god. Every Egyptian king needed more than administrative competence and priestly cooperation to secure lasting legitimacy, and Hatshepsut understood this better than most rulers who came before her. Kingship in Egypt was not simply a political office. It was a theological position, one that connected the person on the throne directly to the divine order that structured the entire cosmos. If she intended her reign to be accepted, not just tolerated, she needed a story explaining her right to rule in terms the gods themselves would recognize. The solution she commissioned was carved into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a structure already rising along the cliffs of western Thebes during these years. This was not a modest addition tucked into some minor corridor. It occupied a prominent colonnade, positioned for maximum visibility to anyone who walked through the temple's terraces. The narrative told there claimed nothing less than divine parentage, asserting that Hatshepsut's true father was not Thutmose I at all, but Amun-Ra himself, chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. According to this carefully constructed account, Amun-Ra took the form of Thutmose III and visited Queen Ahmose in her chambers. The god announced his intentions to the assembled deities beforehand, declaring that a daughter would be born who would rule Egypt with wisdom and strength. Ahmose is depicted receiving the god with evident reverence, the air around them described as filled with divine fragrance. This was not subtle imagery. It was designed to leave no ambiguity about the extraordinary nature of what the reliefs claimed had occurred. The god Khnum, associated with creation and often depicted fashioning human forms on a potter's wheel, appears in this narrative as well. He is shown shaping the infant Hatshepsut and her Ka, her spiritual double, from clay. This detail mattered enormously within Egyptian religious thought, since the Ka represented something like a person's vital essence, a divine spark that connected them to eternity. By claiming that Khnum personally crafted her Ka alongside her physical form, the narrative asserted that Hatshepsut's very being carried divine origin from the moment of her conception. Following the depiction of her conception and shaping, the reliefs move through her birth and early recognition as a figure of destiny. The goddess Hathor is shown participating in the birth itself, alongside other deities who welcome the newborn into the world. Ancient Egyptian gods, including Amun-Ra, are depicted acknowledging the child and predicting the greatness of her future reign. This sequence functioned as visual scripture, a permanent record intended to settle any question about her legitimacy for anyone who doubted it. None of this, of course, reflected literal historical events in any sense a modern observer would recognize. It was propaganda, though that word risks sounding more cynical than the ancient Egyptians themselves would have understood it. Religious narrative and political legitimacy were deeply intertwined in this civilization, and constructing a divine birth story was a recognized method of establishing a ruler's right to the throne. Other kings before and after Hatshepsut employed similar strategies, though rarely with the scale and permanence she achieved at Deir el-Bahari. The temple itself deserves attention as more than a backdrop for this particular narrative. Djeser, meaning something close to Holy of Holies, represented an architectural achievement unlike anything built in Egypt before it. Terraces rose in graduated levels against the cliff face, connected by ramps and lined with colonnades that created rhythmic patterns of light and shadow throughout the day. This design choice was deliberate, since the temple needed to communicate grandeur and divine favor to everyone who approached it from the Nile Valley below. Senenmut's involvement in this project appears to have been substantial, though the precise nature of his role remains debated among historians. Some evidence suggests he may have served as the chief architect, overseeing the temple's unprecedented design from conception through execution. Other reconstructions position him more as a high-ranking overseer, managing resources and labor rather than personally designing every architectural element. Whatever his exact function, the temple stands as a testament to the caliber of talent Hatshepsut had assembled around her ambitious building program. The divine birth narrative did not stand alone within the temple's decorative program. It was accompanied by inscriptions describing an oracle, a moment in which the god Amun supposedly declared through his priests that Hatshepsut should rule Egypt. This oracle narrative worked alongside the birth story to create multiple, overlapping justifications for her kingship. If one story alone seemed insufficient, the combination left little room for doubt among a population raised to take such religious pronouncements seriously. Coronation scenes also appear within this same decorative sequence, depicting Hatshepsut being crowned in the presence of the gods themselves. These images show her receiving the symbols of kingship directly from divine hands, bypassing entirely the human political maneuvering that had actually secured her position. This was, in a sense, the entire point of the exercise. The messy reality of court politics, priestly negotiation, and gradual accumulation of power needed to be replaced, at least in the official record, with a narrative of predestined divine selection. The audience for these carvings was not limited to elite priests capable of reading hieroglyphic inscriptions in full detail. Temple reliefs functioned as public statements even for those who could not read, since the images themselves carried meaning independent of accompanying text. Processions and religious festivals brought crowds through temple precincts regularly, exposing ordinary Egyptians to these carefully constructed visual narratives. Legitimacy, in this sense, was being communicated across every level of society that had access to sacred space. Hatshepsut was hardly the first Egyptian ruler to claim some connection to divine will, since the theology of kingship had always emphasized the pharaoh's special relationship with the gods. What distinguished her approach was the explicitness and scale of the claim, asserting not mere divine favor, but literal divine parentage. This was a bolder assertion than typical royal ideology usually required, reflecting perhaps the unusual nature of the legitimacy problem she needed to solve. A woman ruling as king required justification that went beyond what a male heir following conventional succession would have needed. Scholars examining this narrative today generally read it as evidence of political anxiety rather than simple confidence. A ruler entirely secure in an uncontested position rarely feels compelled to construct elaborate divine justifications for their rule. The very thoroughness of the Deir el-Bahari narrative suggests that Hatshepsut, or at least those advising her, recognized the precariousness inherent in her unprecedented position. Every additional layer of divine sanction served as insurance against future challenges to her legitimacy. The parallel between this divine birth narrative and stories associated with other Egyptian kings deserves brief mention, since later rulers would draw on similar templates for their own legitimacy claims. Amenhotep III, ruling generations after Hatshepsut, commissioned a comparable divine birth sequence at Luxor Temple, borrowing heavily from the structure she had established at Deir el-Bahari. This suggests her innovation was recognized as effective propaganda by subsequent generations, worth imitating rather than dismissing as an isolated eccentricity tied to her specific circumstances. Beyond its function as political and religious justification, the temple decoration also served as historical record in a sense, immortalizing events as Hatshepsut wished them remembered rather than as they had actually unfolded. This blending of history and myth was not considered dishonest by ancient Egyptian standards, since religious and historical truth operated according to different rules than modern readers might expect. The temple walls recorded what Hatshepsut needed to be true for her reign to function smoothly, and in the world of Egyptian sacred kingship, that need itself carried genuine weight. By the time this decorative program was complete, Hatshepsut had constructed something remarkable, a permanent, monumental argument for her own right to rule, carved into stone where it would outlast any spoken justification or court maneuvering. Thutmose III, whatever his private thoughts on the matter, continued to be acknowledged in the temple's broader decorative scheme, even as his aunt's divine legitimacy claims surrounded him. The kingdom moved forward under this dual arrangement, its stability resting now not just on practical administration, but on a carefully built theological foundation. Whether that foundation would prove durable across the reign's remaining years was a question only time would answer. Chapter 6: The Man She Trusted. Every powerful ruler accumulates a circle of trusted officials, but few relationships in Egyptian history have generated as much curiosity among later observers as the one between Hatshepsut and a man named Senenmut. He had already appeared at the edges of her story, managing building projects and steadily accumulating responsibility during her years as regent. By the time her kingship had fully solidified, he stood as perhaps the single most influential non-royal figure in her entire administration. Understanding him means understanding something essential about how she chose to govern. Senenmut's origins offered no hint of the prominence he would eventually achieve. His parents, Ramos and Hatnofer, held no notable titles or elite standing within Egyptian society, based on what their modest burial equipment reveals to archaeologists today. This was not a family connected by birth to the halls of Theban power. Whatever advancement Senenmut achieved, he achieved through demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege, a rarer path to influence in a society that generally rewarded bloodline above talent. His rise through the administrative ranks appears to have begun modestly, with early titles suggesting responsibility over relatively minor royal properties and functions. Over time, these responsibilities expanded considerably, until inscriptions credit him with more than 80 distinct titles across his career. Some of these were largely honorific, the kind of accumulated status markers that Egyptian officials collected as symbols of prestige. Others reflected genuine, substantial authority over critical areas of the kingdom's administration, including royal building projects and the management of significant estates. Among his most significant roles was serving as tutor to Neferrer, Hatshepsut's daughter from her marriage to Thutmose II. This position placed him in direct, sustained proximity to the royal family in a capacity that went well beyond typical bureaucratic distance. Several surviving statues depict Senenmut holding the young princess, an image type rarely used for officials outside the immediate royal family. These statues suggest a level of intimacy and trust that historians have puzzled over for generations, wondering exactly what relationship they reflect. Speculation about a romantic or sexual relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut has circulated widely, both among ancient observers and modern historians reconstructing this period. Some point to graffiti discovered near Deir el-Bahari, crude sketches that some interpret as depicting the queen and her official in an intimate encounter. Others argue this graffiti reflects nothing more than common workman's humor, unrelated to any actual historical relationship between the two figures. The evidence remains genuinely ambiguous, resistant to the kind of certainty that popular retellings sometimes claim to offer. What can be stated with more confidence is that Senenmut occupied an unusually central position in Hatshepsut's court, regardless of whether that centrality carried any romantic dimension. He oversaw major elements of her ambitious building program, including likely involvement in the design and construction of Djezir itself. This was not a minor undertaking assigned to a peripheral figure. It represented one of the most significant architectural achievements of the entire dynasty, and Hatshepsut entrusted its execution to a man whose family had held no prior claim to such responsibility. Senenmut also held responsibility over the royal treasury and various estates dedicated to the god Amun, positioning him at the intersection of economic and religious authority within the kingdom. This combination of roles gave him enormous practical influence over resources that funded much of Hatshepsut's building program and broader administrative agenda. Few officials in Egyptian history accumulated this particular combination of overlapping responsibilities, and the pattern suggests a ruler who valued consolidated competence over distributing power across multiple rival factions. His tomb, discovered in the area near Deir el-Bahari, offers additional insight into his extraordinary status. Unlike typical officials of his era, he was permitted to construct a tomb in remarkably close proximity to Hatshepsut's own mortuary temple, a privilege that reflected his exceptional standing. He also commissioned an unusual, unfinished second tomb that included an astronomical ceiling depicting constellations and celestial deities, a level of sophistication rarely seen in the funerary preparations of non-royal officials during this period. Some evidence suggests that Senenmut's prominence eventually generated friction within the broader court, though the details remain frustratingly incomplete. His name and image appear to have been deliberately damaged or erased in certain contexts, a fate that sometimes befell officials who fell out of favor before their deaths. Whether this reflects a genuine rupture with Hatshepsut during her lifetime or later political dynamics following her death remains a matter of scholarly debate rather than settled fact. The relationship between Senenmut and the growing Thutmose III presents another layer of complexity worth considering. As the young king matured and eventually assumed sole rule following Hatshepsut's death, any official who had been closely associated with her unprecedented kingship faced an uncertain future. Some historians suggest that Senenmut may have died before Hatshepsut herself, sparing him from whatever reckoning followed her passing. Others propose that his disappearance from the record reflects a fall from grace that occurred during the final years of her own reign. What makes Senenmut's story compelling beyond the speculation about his personal relationship with Hatshepsut is what he represents about her broader approach to governance. She was willing to elevate talent regardless of inherited status, entrusting enormous responsibility to a man whose family had held no prior claim to influence. This pattern extended beyond Senenmut alone, reflecting a court culture that Hatshepsut appears to have deliberately cultivated, one that rewarded demonstrated competence in service of her ambitious agenda. Other officials rose alongside Senenmut during this period, forming a broader administrative class whose fortunes were tied directly to the success of Hatshepsut's reign. Men like Hapusineb, who held significant religious authority as high priest of Amun, worked alongside Senenmut in service of the same royal agenda. This collaborative administrative structure allowed Hatshepsut to manage an ambitious building program, active trade relationships, and ongoing religious obligations simultaneously, distributing responsibility among trusted subordinates rather than attempting to personally oversee every detail. The building projects Senenmut oversaw were not limited to the temple at Deir el-Bahari alone, extensive as that undertaking was. He also appears connected to work at Karnak, where Hatshepsut commissioned significant additions to the temple complex dedicated to Amun. Coordinating labor, materials, and skilled artisans across multiple simultaneous projects required genuine administrative sophistication, the kind of capability that justified whatever unusual trust Hatshepsut placed in this particular official. His statues, more numerous than those commissioned for most non-royal officials of this era, depict him in various poses that emphasize his connection to both the royal family and to Amun's priesthood. Several show him seated with sacred texts or symbols associated with religious knowledge, suggesting an image he wished to project of scholarly as well as administrative competence. This self-presentation reveals a man conscious of his own historical legacy, eager to be remembered as more than a mere functionary executing royal orders. The mystery surrounding Senenmut's ultimate fate, whether he died naturally during Hatshepsut's reign or fell from favor before her death, reflects a broader challenge facing anyone studying this period of Egyptian history. Inscriptions were commissioned to celebrate achievement, not to record failure or disgrace, leaving gaps in the record precisely where the most interesting human dynamics likely occurred. What remains clear is that for a significant portion of Hatshepsut's rise and reign, this one official occupied a position of trust and responsibility unmatched by nearly anyone else in her court. By the time Hatshepsut's reign reached its later years, the collaborative structure she had built with officials like Senenmut had produced tangible results across nearly every domain of governance. Temples had risen along the Nile bearing her name and image. Trade relationships had expanded the kingdom's wealth and international standing. Administrative continuity had been maintained despite the unprecedented nature of a woman ruling as king. Whatever the precise truth of her personal relationship with the man who helped make much of this possible, his contribution to the substance of her reign is difficult to overstate. Chapter 7: A Kingdom at Peace. Egypt under Hatshepsut's rule settled into a period markedly different from the military intensity that had characterized her father's reign decades earlier. Thutmose I had built his legacy on the battlefield, driving Egyptian influence deep into Nubia and across the Levant through repeated campaigns. Hatshepsut, by contrast, presided over a kingdom that experienced remarkably little large-scale warfare during the height of her rule. This was not weakness. It reflected a deliberate set of priorities, ones oriented toward internal consolidation and economic expansion rather than continued territorial conquest. Stability of this kind did not happen automatically, even for a kingdom as well organized as Egypt had become by this period. Administrative continuity required careful management of provincial governors, temple estates, and the complex tax system that funded the entire apparatus of the state. Hatshepsut's officials, men like Senenmut and Hapusinib, oversaw much of this machinery on her behalf, allowing the kingdom to function smoothly despite the unprecedented nature of its ruler's position. Their competence mattered enormously, since any significant administrative failure could have provided ammunition to those still uncertain about a woman ruling as king. Trade flourished during these years in ways that would have been impossible amid constant military campaigning. Egypt's relationships with neighboring regions, from Nubia in the south to territories along the eastern Mediterranean, remained largely peaceful and commercially productive. Gold continued flowing north from Nubian mines, funding building projects and temple offerings throughout the kingdom. This economic foundation gave Hatshepsut resources that a more militarily focused ruler might have spent instead on maintaining armies and supply lines for distant campaigns. This is not to suggest that military force disappeared entirely from Egyptian policy during her reign. Inscriptions do record some activity in Nubia, including expeditions that suggest continued Egyptian assertion of authority in that region. There is also evidence of minor campaigns in the Levant, though nothing approaching the scale of conquest that later characterized Thutmose III's independent reign. Hatshepsut maintained enough military readiness to protect Egyptian interests without pursuing the aggressive expansion that had defined earlier reigns. The relative absence of major warfare allowed resources to flow instead toward an ambitious building program that reshaped much of Thebes and other important religious centers. Temples received new additions, existing structures were renovated and expanded, and entirely new monuments rose along the Nile, bearing Hatshepsut's name and image. This building activity served multiple purposes simultaneously, honoring the gods, providing employment for skilled laborers, and permanently inscribing her reign into Egypt's physical landscape in ways that mere administrative competence never could. Agricultural productivity remained the foundation of Egyptian prosperity throughout this period, tied intimately to the Nile's annual flood cycle. Good flood years brought abundant harvests, filling temple and state granaries with surplus that could fund ambitious projects and support a growing population. There is no strong evidence of major famine or agricultural crisis during Hatshepsut's reign, suggesting the Nile cooperated reasonably well with her broader ambitions during these years. This kind of environmental good fortune, whether attributed to divine favor or simple chance, gave her governance a foundation of material prosperity to build upon. The administrative structure Hatshepsut inherited from previous reigns required ongoing refinement rather than wholesale reinvention. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, continued managing local affairs across Egypt's various administrative districts, reporting to central authority in Thebes. Hatshepsut's government maintained oversight of this system while allowing enough local autonomy to keep the machinery functioning efficiently across a kingdom of considerable geographic extent. This balance between central control and local flexibility had been refined over generations, and she showed little inclination to disrupt what already worked reasonably well. Religious life during this period reflected the priorities Hatshepsut had established through her own titles and public presentation. The cult of Amun received particular attention and investment, unsurprising given her personal history as God's wife of Amun and her reliance on that priesthood's support for her unusual kingship. Temple festivals, processions, and offerings continued according to established calendars, with Hatshepsut herself participating directly in many of these rituals. This visible piety served practical political purposes, while also reflecting what appears to have been genuine religious conviction on her part. Court life during these peaceful years developed its own particular character, shaped by a ruler whose priorities differed noticeably from the militaristic culture of previous reigns. Officials who excelled at administration, architecture, and religious management found opportunities for advancement that a more war-focused court might have reserved primarily for successful military commanders. This shift in what the court valued and rewarded had lasting effects on the composition of Egypt's ruling class, elevating figures whose talents lay outside traditional battlefield accomplishment. Thutmose III, meanwhile, continued growing older within this relatively peaceful kingdom, receiving military training that would later prove enormously significant despite the absence of major campaigns during these years. Some historians have wondered whether this training reflected genuine preparation for a future independent reign, or simply the conventional education expected of any royal male regardless of immediate political circumstances. Whatever the intention, the young king was absorbing skills and knowledge that would eventually make him one of history's most accomplished military commanders once circumstances changed. International relationships extended beyond simple trade during this period, encompassing diplomatic exchanges with various foreign powers and regions. Egypt's reputation for wealth and stability attracted interest from neighboring kingdoms, and Hatshepsut's government appears to have maintained these relationships through careful diplomacy rather than military intimidation alone. This approach reflected practical wisdom as much as personal preference, since a kingdom focused on internal building and prosperity had less need for the kind of aggressive posturing that characterized more expansionist reigns. The wealth generated during these peaceful years found expression not just in temple construction, but in the broader material culture of elite Egyptian society. Tomb decorations from this period show increasing sophistication and variety, reflecting both artistic development and the resources available to commission elaborate funerary preparations. Officials who served Hatshepsut successfully were rewarded with wealth that allowed them to commission tombs and monuments reflecting their status, creating a visible record of prosperity that extended beyond the royal family alone. Female participation in religious and administrative life, while never approaching anything resembling widespread gender equality by modern standards, seems to have found somewhat greater visibility during Hatshepsut's reign than in many other periods of Egyptian history. This makes sense given the unprecedented nature of the ruler herself, though the extent of this effect on ordinary women's lives remains difficult to measure from surviving evidence. What can be observed is that royal women, including Hatshepsut's daughter Neferure, held visible religious titles and public roles throughout this period. The absence of major military crisis during these years should not be mistaken for an absence of political challenge entirely. Maintaining a woman's unprecedented claim to kingship required continuous management of court opinion, priestly support, and administrative loyalty, even without the added complication of active warfare. Hatshepsut's government had to work constantly to reinforce the legitimacy established through her divine birth narrative and oracle claims, since a single significant setback could have provided ammunition for critics still uncertain about her position. Grain surpluses, expanding trade, and successful building projects combined to create an image of a kingdom functioning smoothly under her direction, an image that mattered enormously for the broader project of legitimizing her unusual reign. Success, in this sense, was not merely a matter of personal satisfaction for Hatshepsut. It served as ongoing evidence that her kingship, however unprecedented, was working exactly as effective Egyptian rule was supposed to work. Prosperity became its own form of political argument, one that inscriptions and monuments would continue making long after her death. By the time this period of relative peace reached its later years, Egypt stood as a kingdom transformed in subtle but significant ways from what it had been under previous rulers. Temples had multiplied and expanded. Trade networks had deepened and diversified. Administrative continuity had proven that a woman could occupy the throne without the kingdom collapsing into the crisis that some might have predicted. What remained ahead was perhaps the most ambitious undertaking of this peaceful era, a trading expedition that would become one of the most celebrated achievements of her entire reign. Chapter 8: The Temple on the Cliffs. Every element of Hatshepsut's reign eventually found its way into stone, but no single structure captured her ambitions as completely as the temple she built into the cliffs of western Thebes. Djeser, a name meaning something close to Holy of Holies or Sacred of Sacreds, rose from the desert floor in a location previous kings had recognized as significant. Mentuhotep II, ruler of Egypt centuries earlier, had built his own more modest mortuary temple nearby, and Hatshepsut's architects deliberately positioned her structure to reference that earlier monument. This was not accidental proximity. It was a calculated visual argument connecting her reign to legitimate precedent. The site itself presented both opportunity and challenge for anyone attempting monumental construction. Sheer limestone cliffs rose dramatically behind the chosen location, creating a natural backdrop that no human architect could hope to replicate through artificial means. The temple needed to work with this landscape rather than against it, incorporating the cliffs into its overall design rather than treating them as mere scenery. Whoever conceived the temple's ultimate form understood this challenge intimately, producing a structure that seems to grow organically from the rock face itself. 3 terraces, rising in sequence from the valley floor toward the cliffs, formed the temple's basic structural logic. Each terrace connected to the next through gently rising ramps positioned along the central axis, creating a processional path that guided visitors upward through the sacred space. This was architecture designed for movement and experience, not merely for static visual impact from a single vantage point. Anyone walking through the temple encountered a sequence of revelations, each terrace offering different views and different decorative programs as they ascended toward the sanctuary carved into the cliff itself. Colonnades lined each terrace, their columns creating rhythmic patterns of light and shadow that shifted throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. This interplay of light was not incidental to the design. Egyptian architects understood how sunlight would interact with their structures, and the colonnades at Deir el-Bahari were positioned to create dramatic effects during specific times of day and specific religious festivals. Visitors experiencing the temple during these moments would have witnessed something genuinely theatrical, light and stone working together to create an atmosphere of sacred significance. The lowest terrace featured gardens, an unusual addition for an Egyptian mortuary temple that speaks to the ambitious scope of Hatshepsut's vision for the site. Tree pits discovered by archaeologists suggest that actual living trees, including myrrh trees brought back from the famous expedition to Punt, were planted here. This detail connects the temple's physical structure directly to one of the signature achievements of Hatshepsut's reign, transforming the building itself into a permanent monument to that successful trading venture. Few architectural projects in ancient history so directly incorporated the fruits of a specific historical event into their physical fabric. Reliefs decorating the temple's walls covered an extraordinary range of subject matter, from the divine birth narrative establishing Hatshepsut's legitimacy to detailed depictions of the Punt expedition itself. This decorative program functioned as more than mere ornamentation. It was a comprehensive visual history of the reign, carefully curated to present events exactly as Hatshepsut wished them remembered by anyone who walked through the temple in centuries to come. Every scene served a purpose within this larger narrative strategy, nothing included by accident or mere aesthetic preference. The temple also incorporated chapels dedicated to various deities significant to Hatshepsut's religious program, including Hathor and Anubis, alongside the central focus on Amun. The Hathor Chapel, positioned on the middle terrace, featured columns carved with the distinctive cow-eared face of that goddess, associated with music, joy, and maternal protection. This inclusion reflected Hathor's broader significance within Theban religious life, and possibly a personal devotion on Hatshepsut's part to a goddess whose attributes complemented the more austere solar theology centered on Amun-Ra. Construction of a project this scale required enormous coordination of labor, materials, and skilled artisans over an extended period. Quarrying alone represented a massive undertaking, since the temple's limestone needed to be extracted, transported, and shaped according to exacting specifications. Skilled sculptors and painters then transformed this raw material into the detailed reliefs and statuary that would eventually cover nearly every surface of the completed structure. This labor force, drawn from across Egypt, represented a significant investment of the kingdom's resources during years that Hatshepsut's peaceful reign had made available for such ambitious building. Statuary throughout the temple presented Hatshepsut in various guises, from the traditional kneeling pose of an offering pharaoh to the more imposing standing figures wearing full royal regalia, including the ceremonial false beard. Some statues depicted her as a sphinx, combining human features with a lion's body in the traditional Egyptian representation of royal power and protection. This variety of representation allowed the temple to communicate multiple aspects of her authority simultaneously, from pious servant of the gods to powerful sovereign commanding absolute respect. Senenmut's involvement in this project, discussed in relation to his broader career, deserves particular attention regarding the specific innovations the temple introduced. The terraced design, while drawing on earlier precedent from Mentuhotep's nearby structure, achieved a scale and sophistication that surpassed anything built previously in this style. Whether Senenmut personally conceived these innovations or oversaw a team of architects executing a collaborative vision remains uncertain given the fragmentary nature of surviving evidence. What is clear is that the finished structure represented a genuine architectural achievement, regardless of exactly how credit should be distributed among those responsible for its creation. The temple's function extended beyond mere aesthetic or propagandistic purposes into the practical realm of mortuary cult and religious ritual. This was, first and foremost, a mortuary temple designed to receive offerings and maintain rituals dedicated to Hatshepsut's spirit after her death. Priests would have conducted regular ceremonies here, ensuring the continued well-being of her Ka in the afterlife through offerings of food, incense, and prayer. This practical religious function operated alongside the temple's more overtly political messaging, the two purposes intertwined rather than separate concerns. Positioning the temple's innermost sanctuary directly into the cliff face carried significant religious symbolism beyond mere structural convenience. This inner sanctuary connected symbolically to the western horizon, associated in Egyptian religious thought with death and the journey into the afterlife. The setting sun each evening would appear to sink directly behind the cliffs housing this sanctuary, creating a powerful visual connection between the temple's location and the solar theology central to Egyptian religious belief. Nothing about this positioning was accidental, reflecting instead careful theological planning integrated into the architectural design itself. Later history did not treat this temple kindly in every respect, since subsequent rulers and natural forces alike left their mark on the structure over the following centuries. Thutmose III's later campaign against Hatshepsut's memory included damage to some of the temple's inscriptions and imagery, a topic that later chapters in this chronicle will address more fully. Earthquakes and general deterioration over 3.5 millennia also took their toll on the original structure. Modern archaeological restoration, conducted primarily by Polish and Egyptian teams over recent decades, has worked to reconstruct and stabilize what remains of this remarkable achievement. Visitors to the site today, or anyone viewing photographs and reconstructions, encounter a structure that still communicates the essential qualities Hatshepsut's architects intended more than 3,000 years ago. The clean geometric lines, the dramatic integration with the surrounding cliffs, and the sheer scale of the terraced design continue to impress observers who study Egyptian architecture across its full history. Few structures from the ancient world combine landscape and building so seamlessly, creating an effect that feels simultaneously monumental and organic. The temple's broader significance within Hatshepsut's reign extended beyond its function as a single impressive structure. It represented the physical culmination of everything her government had achieved during years of peaceful prosperity: the wealth to fund ambitious construction, the administrative sophistication to coordinate such a massive undertaking, and the theological confidence to build something without clear precedent in Egyptian architectural history. Every terrace, every relief, every carefully positioned column reinforced the same essential message that her divine birth narrative had already established elsewhere within these same walls. By the time Djeser neared completion, it stood as perhaps the clearest physical embodiment of what Hatshepsut's reign had accomplished and what she wished future generations to remember about her rule. The temple would outlast her by millennia, weathering damage and neglect while still communicating something of the ambition that had brought it into existence. What remained to be permanently recorded on its walls, beyond the divine birth narrative already discussed, was the story of an expedition that had reached beyond Egypt's borders entirely, journeying south to a distant land called Punt in search of treasures that would further glorify her extraordinary reign. Chapter 9: Voyage to Punt. Somewhere in Hatshepsut's 9th regnal year, or perhaps slightly earlier depending on how various inscriptions are interpreted, preparations began for one of the most celebrated undertakings of her entire reign. The destination was a land the Egyptians called Punt, a place associated in their thought with luxury, exotic goods, and near mythical distance from the familiar world of the Nile Valley. Exact location of Punt remains debated among modern scholars, with proposals ranging across the Horn of Africa and the southern Red Sea coast. What mattered to Hatshepsut's contemporaries was not precise geography so much as the reputation this land carried for producing goods unavailable anywhere closer to home. Egypt's relationship with Punt was not new when Hatshepsut commissioned her famous expedition. Earlier kings, stretching back centuries, had recorded contact with this distant land, importing valuable goods through trade relationships that predated her reign considerably. What distinguished her expedition was not the basic concept of trading with Punt, but the scale, documentation, and propaganda value she extracted from the venture. Few previous contacts had been so thoroughly recorded, and none had been immortalized on temple walls with anything approaching the detail Hatshepsut commissioned. The expedition itself involved a fleet of ships constructed specifically for this long maritime journey down the Red Sea coast. Egyptian shipbuilders, though more accustomed to Nile River vessels than open-water sailing craft, adapted their techniques to produce ships capable of the longer voyage required. These vessels needed to carry not just a crew sufficient for sailing and rowing, but also trade goods intended for exchange once they reached their destination. Organizing this fleet represented a significant logistical achievement in its own right, well before any ship actually departed Egyptian waters. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict the fleet's arrival at Punt in considerable detail, offering modern historians a rare visual record of ancient trade contact. The ruler of Punt, identified in inscriptions as Pharaoh, appears alongside his wife, a woman whose unusual physical proportions have generated significant scholarly commentary and speculation over the decades. She is depicted with an exaggerated curvature of the spine and considerable body size, details some interpret as reflecting an actual medical condition rather than artistic exaggeration or caricature. Egyptian artists rarely depicted foreign rulers with such specific, seemingly individualized physical characteristics. The goods brought back from this expedition read, in the temple inscriptions, like a catalog of exotic luxury calculated to impress anyone who encountered the list. Myrrh trees, transported with their root balls intact for replanting in Egypt, represented perhaps the most celebrated cargo of the entire venture. Frankincense, another aromatic resin highly valued in Egyptian religious ritual, filled additional cargo space alongside these transplanted trees. This was not incidental cargo. Aromatic resins held central importance in temple ceremonies throughout Egypt, making their acquisition a matter of genuine religious as well as commercial significance. Beyond these aromatic treasures, the expedition returned with a striking variety of additional goods documented in the temple reliefs. Ebony wood, prized for its dense, dark beauty, appears among the cargo alongside ivory harvested from elephant tusks. Gold, always valuable within Egyptian economic and religious life, is also listed among the returned treasures. Exotic animals accompanied these material goods as well, including baboons and what inscriptions describe as a panther or similar large cat, creatures that would have astonished anyone in Thebes unfamiliar with such distant fauna. The reliefs documenting this expedition go beyond simply cataloging goods received, extending into genuine ethnographic detail about Puntite society as the Egyptians observed it. Houses in Punt are depicted as raised structures, built on stilts or platforms and accessed by ladders, a building style clearly distinct from Egyptian domestic architecture. Local flora and fauna appear rendered with evident curiosity, suggesting the artists responsible for these reliefs worked from genuine reports or perhaps sketches brought back by expedition members who had witnessed this unfamiliar landscape directly. Hatshepsut's decision to commission such extensive documentation of this expedition reflects the same strategic thinking evident throughout her broader building program. This was not merely a commercial venture valuable for its economic returns alone. It was transformed, through careful curation on temple walls, into another pillar supporting her claim to legitimate, successful kingship. A ruler capable of organizing successful contact with such a distant and exotic land demonstrated exactly the kind of capability that Egyptian kingship was supposed to embody, reaching beyond Egypt's borders to bring back wonders for the benefit of the gods and the kingdom. The religious dimension of this expedition deserves particular emphasis, since much of what was brought back served explicitly religious rather than purely luxury purposes. Myrrh and frankincense fed directly into temple ritual, burned as incense during ceremonies dedicated to Amun and other deities central to Egyptian worship. By securing a fresh, substantial supply of these materials, Hatshepsut ensured that religious ceremonies throughout the kingdom could continue at whatever scale her ambitious building and ritual program required. This practical religious benefit reinforced the propaganda value already inherent in the expedition's exotic character. Inscriptions describe the expedition as having been commanded by the god Amun himself, framing the entire venture within the same divine sanction that characterized Hatshepsut's birth narrative and coronation claims elsewhere in the temple. According to this framing, Amun desired that his temple receive these treasures, and Hatshepsut, as his chosen ruler, organized the expedition to fulfill divine will. This religious framing transformed what might otherwise have been understood as a straightforward commercial venture into another demonstration of Hatshepsut's special relationship with the god who had supposedly fathered her. The individual credited with leading this expedition, based on surviving inscriptions, appears to have been an official named Nessie, though the exact command structure and division of responsibility among various officials involved remains somewhat unclear from available evidence. Organizing an expedition of this scale required coordination among ship captains, trade negotiators, and whoever managed the practical logistics of provisioning vessels for an extended maritime journey. This was a collaborative undertaking, drawing on the same kind of administrative competence that characterized Hatshepsut's broader governing style. News of the expedition's successful return would have spread quickly through Thebes and likely throughout Egypt more broadly, given the exotic and impressive nature of what the ships carried. Public reception of such news mattered enormously for a ruler whose legitimacy rested partly on demonstrated success and divine favor. A failed or disappointing expedition might have provided ammunition for critics questioning her unprecedented kingship. Instead, the venture's evident success provided fresh material, reinforcing the image of prosperity and divine favor that her government worked continuously to project. The myrrh trees themselves, planted in the gardens of Djeser, according to archaeological evidence discovered in the temple's lowest terrace, created a living, permanent connection between the expedition and Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. Anyone visiting the temple in the years following the expedition's return could see these actual trees, tangible proof of the distant journey that inscriptions elsewhere described in such vivid detail. This physical evidence gave the expedition's story a concrete presence that mere written or carved narrative alone could not achieve. Comparative context helps illuminate just how significant this expedition was within the broader sweep of Egyptian history. While contact with Punt had occurred intermittently across centuries of Egyptian civilization, few expeditions received documentation approaching the scale and detail Hatshepsut commissioned for her venture. This suggests either an expedition of unusual size and success, exceptional propaganda instincts on the part of Hatshepsut and her officials, or more likely some combination of both factors working together to produce this remarkable historical record. The expedition to Punt has become, in the centuries since its rediscovery by modern archaeologists and historians, one of the signature achievements associated with Hatshepsut's reign specifically. This reputation reflects the vivid, detailed nature of the temple documentation as much as the actual historical significance of the trade contact itself. Other Egyptian rulers organized comparable trading ventures without leaving behind anything approaching this level of visual and textual record, meaning Hatshepsut's expedition looms larger in popular historical memory, partly because of how thoroughly she chose to commemorate it. By the time this expedition had been fully documented on the walls of Djezir, Hatshepsut had added another substantial pillar to the foundation of legitimacy and achievement she had spent years constructing. Divine birth, successful administration, ambitious building projects, and now a celebrated trading venture to a distant, exotic land, all combined into a comprehensive portrait of successful, divinely sanctioned kingship. What remained was to extend this record of achievement into the more traditional realm of monumental building associated with Egyptian kings for generations, raising towering obelisks that would announce her reign to anyone who gazed upon the temple complex at Karnak. Chapter 10: Needles of Granite. Karnak had already been receiving royal attention for generations by the time Hatshepsut turned her ambitions toward the great temple complex dedicated to Amun. Her father, Thutmose III, had added pylons and obelisks of his own, establishing a pattern of continuous royal investment that each subsequent king felt obligated to continue in some form. Hatshepsut did not merely continue this pattern. She pursued additions to Karnak on a scale that rivaled or exceeded what any previous ruler had attempted, leaving a physical mark on Egypt's most important religious site that would endure for millennia. Among her most striking contributions were two towering obelisks, carved from single blocks of red granite quarried at Aswan, far to the south along the Nile. These monuments stood among the tallest ever erected in Egypt, reaching heights that required extraordinary engineering skill simply to quarry, transport, and ultimately raise into position. Obelisks of this scale represented one of the most technically demanding undertakings any Egyptian ruler could commission, and Hatshepsut's decision to pursue not one, but a pair of these monuments speaks to the ambition that characterized her broader building program. The quarrying process alone required skills refined over centuries of Egyptian stoneworking tradition. Workers used tools of dolerite, a stone harder than the granite they were extracting, to pound away material and gradually free the obelisk's rough shape from the surrounding bedrock. This was slow, exhausting labor, conducted under the harsh sun of Upper Egypt, with methods that relied almost entirely on human effort and simple mechanical principles. An unfinished obelisk, abandoned partway through this process due to cracking in the stone, still lies at the Aswan quarry today, offering modern visitors a rare glimpse into the physical reality of this ancient undertaking. Transporting a finished obelisk from Aswan to Thebes presented challenges nearly as daunting as the quarrying itself. These massive stone monuments needed to travel by river, loaded onto specially constructed barges capable of bearing their enormous weight without capsizing or breaking apart under the strain. Inscriptions and later depictions from other periods of Egyptian history suggest that such barges were towed by numerous vessels working in coordination, their crews navigating the Nile's currents while managing cargo that could weigh several hundred tons for the largest examples. Once the obelisks reached Thebes, the challenge shifted from transportation to the equally demanding task of erecting them vertically at Karnak. Egyptian engineers had developed techniques for this purpose over generations, likely involving earthen ramps built up around the intended location, allowing the obelisk to be gradually maneuvered from horizontal to vertical position through a combination of leverage, ropes, and sheer coordinated human effort. The precision required to complete this maneuver without damaging the monument reflects a level of engineering sophistication that continues to impress modern observers studying ancient construction methods. Hatshepsut's obelisks were not left as plain, unadorned granite once successfully raised into position. Inscriptions covered their surfaces, recording her titles, her achievements, and explicit statements connecting the monuments to her relationship with Amun. One surviving inscription describes her motivation in constructing these obelisks, framing the project as an act of devotion intended to honor her divine father and secure his continued favor. This textual dimension transformed the obelisks from mere impressive engineering achievements into permanent theological statements, reinforcing themes already established through her divine birth narrative at Deir el-Bahari. The tips of these obelisks, called pyramidions, received a distinctive treatment that added further symbolic weight to the monuments. Evidence suggests these pyramidions were covered in electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that would have caught sunlight dramatically, creating a brilliant point atop each towering shaft of granite. This treatment connected the obelisks visually and symbolically to solar worship, since the sun god Ra held central importance within Egyptian religious thought, and the gleaming pyramidion evoked the sun's own radiant light striking the earth. Positioning these obelisks within the broader Karnak complex required careful consideration of existing structures and processional pathways used during religious festivals. Hatshepsut placed her monuments in locations that maximized their visibility and impact for anyone moving through the temple during major ceremonies. This was not incidental placement. Egyptian religious architecture operated according to careful spatial logic, and the positioning of new monuments needed to enhance rather than disrupt the established rhythms of ritual movement through sacred space. One particular obelisk, still standing today at Karnak, has become recognized as the tallest surviving ancient Egyptian obelisk still in its original location. This survival represents a remarkable stroke of fortune, given the destruction and displacement that befell so many other ancient Egyptian monuments over the following millennia. Visitors to Karnak today can still see this towering shaft of granite inscribed with Hatshepsut's titles and achievements, standing as a direct physical connection to her ambitious building program nearly 3,500 years after its original construction. The scale of resources required for this obelisk project illustrates the substantial wealth Hatshepsut's government commanded during this period of relative peace and prosperity. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting monuments of this size required coordinated labor drawn from across the kingdom, skilled craftsmen capable of executing precise inscriptions, and administrative oversight capable of managing such a complex, multi-stage undertaking. This was not a project any ruler could pursue casually. It demanded exactly the kind of stable, well-resourced government that Hatshepsut's peaceful reign had successfully established. Later history was not entirely kind to these monuments, despite their impressive scale and careful construction. Thutmose III, during his later sole reign, ordered a wall built around the base of one obelisk, obscuring it from view while apparently stopping short of outright destruction. This act reflects the complicated relationship between the young king and his aunt's memory, a topic that later chapters in this chronicle will examine in considerably more detail. For now, it is enough to note that even monuments as physically imposing as these granite obelisks were not immune to the political currents that eventually swept through Egypt following Hatshepsut's death. Beyond the obelisks themselves, Hatshepsut commissioned additional structures and modifications throughout the Karnak complex, expanding and enhancing the sacred precinct dedicated to Amun in ways that extended well beyond these two dramatic monuments. A structure known as the Red Chapel, built to house the sacred bark used in Amun's processional festivals, represented another significant contribution to the temple complex. This building, constructed from red quartzite and black granite, featured extensive relief decoration recording various aspects of Hatshepsut's reign and her relationship with the god she served. The Red Chapel's later history mirrors, in some ways, the fate of the obelisks themselves. It was eventually dismantled by later rulers, its blocks repurposed within other construction projects at Karnak, rather than being deliberately destroyed. Modern archaeologists, working through decades of careful research, eventually identified and reassembled many of these scattered blocks, reconstructing the chapel's original appearance in ways that offer valuable insight into Hatshepsut's building program and artistic priorities during this period of her reign. Craftsmen responsible for the intricate relief work covering these Karnak monuments operated according to artistic conventions that had developed over centuries of Egyptian religious art, while still finding room for innovation within those established boundaries. The quality of carving on Hatshepsut's Karnak monuments reflects access to the kingdom's most skilled artisans, individuals whose training and talent placed them among the elite craftsmen of their generation. This level of artistic investment mattered enormously for monuments intended to communicate royal legitimacy and divine favor to everyone who encountered them. The broader significance of this Karnak building program extended beyond mere architectural or artistic achievement into the realm of theological and political statement. Every addition Hatshepsut made to this sacred complex reinforced her connection to Amun, the god whose favor and supposed parentage underpinned her entire claim to legitimate kingship. This was consistent, deliberate reinforcement, building temple by temple and monument by monument toward a comprehensive religious and political argument that would have been difficult for any observer to miss while moving through Karnak during Hatshepsut's reign. By the time these obelisks and additional structures had been completed, Hatshepsut had transformed Karnak in ways that would influence the sacred complex's appearance and religious significance for generations of Egyptians who followed her. Her monuments stood alongside those of previous kings, adding her own chapter to a site that had already accumulated centuries of royal investment before she ever commissioned a single addition. What remained was to extend this same theological and political vision into her formal religious titles and duties, particularly the role of God's wife of Amun that had shaped so much of her path toward unprecedented kingship in the first place. Chapter 11: The God's Wife. Before Hatshepsut ever claimed the throne of Egypt, She held a religious title that shaped much of her early identity and political foundation. God's wife of Amun was among the most significant offices available to a woman within Egyptian religious life, carrying influence that extended well beyond ceremonial participation in temple ritual. Understanding this title matters enormously for understanding how Hatshepsut eventually justified and executed her transformation from royal wife into reigning king. The office gave her a foothold within religious authority that few other candidates for power, male or female, could have matched. The origins of this title stretched back before Hatshepsut's own lifetime, evolving over generations into an office of considerable religious and economic significance by the time she inherited it. Earlier queens had held versions of this title, participating in rituals connected to Amun's cult at Thebes. What the office meant in practical terms shifted somewhat across different reigns, but by Hatshepsut's era, it carried substantial weight within the religious hierarchy centered at Karnak. She received this title during her marriage to Thutmose II, well before her later assumption of full kingship. Practical duties associated with the office of God's wife involved direct participation in temple ritual, particularly ceremonies connected to Amun's cult that required a female participant representing the goddess Hathor or other feminine divine principles. Egyptian religious thought understood the relationship between gods and their consorts as essential to maintaining cosmic order, and the god's wife filled this symbolic role within Amun's earthly cult at Karnak. This was not passive ceremonial presence. It required active participation in rituals that priests and temple officials considered essential to the proper functioning of religious life throughout the kingdom. Beyond ritual participation, the office came attached to substantial economic resources, including estates and personnel dedicated specifically to supporting whoever held this title. This economic dimension mattered enormously for understanding Hatshepsut's later political trajectory, since it gave her an independent power base separate from whatever authority she derived through marriage or royal bloodline alone. Few women in Egyptian history commanded resources of this scale through religious office, and Hatshepsut's control over these estates gave her genuine leverage within the broader political and economic structure of the kingdom. Her relationship with the priesthood of Amun developed and deepened considerably through her years holding this title, creating relationships and alliances that would prove essential once she began pursuing her unprecedented claim to kingship. Priests who worked alongside her in temple ritual came to know her capability and religious devotion directly through sustained personal contact rather than mere reputation. This groundwork, built over years of genuine participation in religious life rather than superficial ceremonial appearance, gave her credibility that a more distant or occasional participant in temple ritual could never have achieved. As Hatshepsut's political position evolved from great royal wife through regency and eventually toward full kingship, her relationship to this religious title evolved correspondingly. Some scholars argue that she eventually transferred many of the office's practical duties to her daughter Nefertiti, who appears in various inscriptions performing rituals associated with the god's wife role. This transfer, if accurately reconstructed, would have freed Hatshepsut to focus more fully on the broader responsibilities of kingship while maintaining the office's importance within her extended family and political network. Neferu's training for this religious role appears to have begun relatively early in her life, consistent with the careful attention Hatshepsut paid to positioning her daughter within the kingdom's religious and political structure. Statues and inscriptions depict Neferu participating in temple ritual, sometimes alongside Senenmut in his role as her tutor and guardian. This visible religious training served multiple purposes, preparing Neferu for genuine religious responsibility, while also reinforcing the broader narrative of a family deeply, legitimately embedded within Amun's sacred cult at Thebes. The theological underpinning connecting Hatshepsut's kingship to her religious offices deserves careful attention, since these two dimensions of her authority reinforced each other in ways that a purely political analysis might overlook. Her divine birth narrative claimed Amun-Ra as her literal father, while her position as God's wife of Amun gave her a formal religious relationship to that same deity through ritual office. These two claims work together, creating a comprehensive theological argument for her legitimacy that operated on multiple registers simultaneously, from mythological narrative to ongoing ritual practice. Egyptian religious thought did not draw the same sharp distinctions between political and religious authority that modern secular frameworks typically assume. Kingship itself was understood as a fundamentally religious office, connecting the ruler directly to divine will and cosmic order, rather than representing merely secular political authority. Hatshepsut's accumulation of religious titles alongside her political claims reflected this integrated understanding, building layer upon layer of sacred legitimacy that reinforced rather than competed with her practical governmental authority. Her relationship with the priesthood extended beyond personal religious devotion into practical political alliance, a distinction that would have made little sense within Egyptian religious thought, but proves useful for modern historical analysis. Key priestly figures, including men like Hapusinab, who held the position of High Priest of Amun during her reign, appear to have provided crucial support for her unprecedented claims to kingship. Whether this support reflected genuine religious conviction, pragmatic political calculation, or some combination of both motivations remains difficult to determine from surviving evidence, though the practical effect of their cooperation is clear enough. Temple estates under the control of the God's Wife office, and by extension under Hatshepsut's broader authority, generated resources that fed directly into her ambitious building program throughout Thebes and beyond. This economic dimension connected her religious office directly to the physical monuments that would come to define her reign in the eyes of later historians. Without the resources flowing through this religious apparatus, projects like the temple at Deir el-Bahari and the obelisks at Karnak would have required funding through other, potentially more contested channels of royal authority. The relationship between Hatshepsut's religious titles and her broader public image deserves attention as well, since these offices shaped how ordinary Egyptians and elite courtiers alike understood her role within the kingdom's sacred order. A ruler who held such intimate, sustained connection to Amun's cult carried religious authority that pure political power alone could never fully replicate. This religious dimension of her public identity helped smooth acceptance of her unprecedented political claims, since a woman clearly favored by the gods through demonstrated religious devotion seemed a more plausible candidate for kingship than one relying on political maneuvering alone. Comparisons to later holders of the God's Wife title illuminate just how significant Hatshepsut's tenure in this office proved to be for the institution's subsequent development. In later periods of Egyptian history, particularly during the Third Intermediate Period centuries after Hatshepsut's reign, the office of God's Wife of Amun evolved into an even more powerful position, sometimes rivaling the authority of the king himself in the Theban region. While this later development cannot be attributed directly to Hatshepsut's own tenure, her example demonstrated the political potential inherent in this religious office in ways that likely influenced its subsequent evolution. The integration of religious and political authority that characterized Hatshepsut's approach to kingship reflected broader patterns within Egyptian civilization, though she pursued this integration with unusual thoroughness and evident strategic intention. Every element of her public identity, from her divine birth narrative through her religious titles to her building projects dedicated to Amun, reinforced a consistent theological argument for her legitimacy. This was not scattered or incidental religious devotion. It represented a carefully constructed edifice of sacred authority supporting her unprecedented political position. By the time Hatshepsut's reign had reached its mature phase, the office of God's Wife of Amun had become just one thread, albeit a foundational one, within a much larger tapestry of religious and political authority she had constructed over years of careful development. Her daughter Neferu carried forward much of the office's practical ritual function, while Hatshepsut herself operated at a level of authority that transcended what any previous holder of this title had achieved. What remained ahead was the increasingly complex dynamic between Hatshepsut and the young Thutmose III, whose own claims to kingship persisted alongside hers even as he grew from child toward capable adult, trained in the military arts that would eventually define his own extraordinary reign. Chapter 12: Ruling in Two Names. Egypt operated for nearly 2 decades under an arrangement without clear precedent anywhere in its long history. 2 names appeared in royal cartouches throughout this period, one belonging to Hatshepsut and the other to her nephew Thutmose III, both claiming the authority of kingship simultaneously. This dual arrangement did not resemble a simple division of territory or responsibility between 2 separate rulers. It represented something more unusual, a shared claim to the single office of Pharaoh, with one partner holding vastly more practical authority than the other for most of its duration. Temple reliefs from this period regularly depict both figures together, performing rituals and receiving divine blessings side by side in ways that acknowledged Thutmose III's continued status as king, even while Hatshepsut clearly dominated the practical exercise of that kingship. This visual convention mattered enormously since it maintained the fiction, or perhaps the genuine reality, of a legitimate co-regency rather than an outright usurpation. Egyptian art rarely depicted illegitimate or contested claims to power so openly, suggesting that whatever the true internal dynamics, the official presentation insisted on continued cooperation between the 2 rulers. The precise mechanics of how authority was actually divided between them during these years remains a subject that historians continue to debate, working from fragmentary evidence that rarely spells out day-to-day governmental reality. Hatshepsut's name typically appears first in joint inscriptions, and her titulary generally carries more elaborate and extensive honors than her nephews during this period. This suggests, though it cannot definitively prove, that she held clear seniority within whatever practical arrangements structured their shared rule. Thutmose III's own inscriptions from later in his independent reign offer little direct commentary on how he understood this earlier arrangement. As Thutmose III grew from childhood into adolescence and eventually toward young adulthood, his visibility within official records appears to have increased correspondingly, even while Hatshepsut retained clear primary authority. Military training, likely begun years earlier, would have intensified during this period, as he approached the age when Egyptian princes typically began taking on genuine responsibility. Some historians point to evidence suggesting he may have led or participated in military actions during these years, gaining practical experience that would later prove invaluable once he assumed sole rule following his aunt's death. The Egyptian army maintained its own institutional structure and traditions throughout this period, one that operated somewhat independently from the theological arguments and religious titles Hatshepsut had constructed to justify her own position. Military officers trained in traditions established under Thutmose I's aggressive campaigns represented a constituency whose loyalty and cooperation mattered enormously for the stability of this dual arrangement. Thutmose III's growing involvement with military affairs may have reflected a deliberate strategy, whether his own initiative or Hatshepsut's calculated decision to maintain his connection to this important institutional base even while she controlled the broader machinery of civilian government. Temple construction and religious ceremony continued to feature Hatshepsut far more prominently than her nephew throughout most of this co-regency, reflecting where the practical center of authority genuinely resided. The building projects discussed in earlier chapters, from Djeser to the Karnak obelisks, bear her name and image overwhelmingly rather than any shared credit with Thutmose III. This pattern suggests that whatever cooperative fiction the official record maintained, the substantive achievements of this period were understood even by contemporaries as primarily her accomplishments rather than a genuinely balanced partnership. Court politics during these years must have required careful navigation, balancing the practical reality of Hatshepsut's dominant authority against the theoretical legitimacy that Thutmose III's continued recognition as king provided to the overall arrangement. Officials serving in this court needed to show appropriate deference to both figures, regardless of where actual power resided in practice. This balancing act likely required considerable diplomatic skill from everyone involved, since openly favoring one ruler over the other risked appearing disloyal to whichever party held less immediate favor at any given moment. Some evidence suggests occasional friction within this arrangement, though the fragmentary nature of surviving records makes it difficult to reconstruct specific incidents with confidence. Later actions taken by Thutmose III against his aunt's memory, which subsequent chapters will address in detail, have led some historians to infer that resentment simmered beneath the cooperative surface presented in official monuments. Other scholars caution against reading later actions backward into this earlier period, arguing that Thutmose III's later campaign against Hatshepsut's memory may have reflected different motivations entirely, unrelated to any personal animosity accumulated during their shared reign. The question of succession loomed over this entire arrangement, since Hatshepsut, however secure her practical authority appeared, could not rule indefinitely. Thutmose III's position as her eventual successor seems to have remained intact throughout this period, never seriously challenged by any alternative candidate for the throne. This suggests that whatever tension may have existed between the two rulers, it did not extend to Hatshepsut attempting to permanently exclude her nephew from his eventual inheritance of full sole kingship. ENTIIRE's role during this period adds another layer of complexity to understanding the dynamics at play within the royal family. As Hatshepsut's daughter, holding significant religious titles of her own, she occupied a position that some historians have speculated might have been intended for eventual marriage to Thutmose III, following the pattern of sibling or near-sibling marriage that had characterized previous royal successions. Whether this speculation reflects actual dynastic planning or merely reasonable inference from established patterns remains uncertain, particularly since evidence about Neferu's own fate during this period grows increasingly sparse as the co-regency progressed. Foreign relations and military activity during this period reflect the broader priorities already established under Hatshepsut's primary authority, generally favoring stability and trade over aggressive expansion. Yet the presence of a young king receiving military training alongside these peaceful priorities suggests that preparation for a different future style of rule was already underway, even while current policy remained oriented toward the priorities Hatshepsut had established. This dual character of the period, peaceful administration alongside quiet military preparation, would prove significant once circumstances eventually shifted following her death. Administrative continuity remained a hallmark of this co-regency period, with officials like Senenmut and Hapuseneb continuing to exercise substantial authority throughout most of these years. Their loyalty appears to have remained firmly attached to Hatshepsut specifically, rather than representing genuinely balanced service to both nominal kings. This pattern reinforces the broader picture of an arrangement where practical governmental authority flowed overwhelmingly through Hatshepsut's court, regardless of the formal co-regency structure maintained in official monuments and inscriptions. The length of this dual reign, stretching across roughly 2 decades according to most chronological reconstructions, represents a remarkably durable arrangement given its unprecedented nature within Egyptian tradition. Political arrangements without clear historical precedent often prove unstable, vulnerable to challenge from those uncomfortable with departure from established norms. That this particular arrangement persisted for so long suggests either exceptional political skill on Hatshepsut's part, broad acceptance of the arrangement among key constituencies, or some combination of both factors sustaining stability across these many years. Thutmose III's private thoughts about this extended period of subordinate status, however dignified the official presentation made it appear, remain entirely unknowable from surviving evidence. Modern speculation about resentment, patience, or genuine acceptance all risk projecting assumptions onto a historical figure who left no personal testimony about his emotional experience during these years. What can be observed is his behavior once circumstances eventually changed, behavior that later chapters will examine in considerable detail, though even that evidence permits multiple, sometimes contradictory interpretations of his true feelings during the co-regency itself. As this dual reign moved through its second decade, subtle signs suggest that Thutmose III's practical role may have been gradually expanding, even while Hatshepsut retained clear overall seniority within the arrangement. His growing military experience and increasing visibility in certain inscriptions hint at a young king preparing more actively for eventual sole rule, whether through his own initiative or through arrangements that Hatshepsut herself may have sanctioned as part of a longer-term succession plan. Whatever the precise dynamics, the kingdom continued functioning smoothly under this unusual arrangement, prosperity and stability persisting even as questions about the future inevitably loomed. By the time Hatshepsut reached the later years of her reign, this unprecedented co-regency had produced 2 decades of relative peace, substantial building achievement, and successful trade expansion, regardless of whatever private tensions may have existed beneath the surface. Thutmose III stood ready, trained and experienced, for whatever role awaited him once his aunt's reign eventually concluded. What remained uncertain was exactly how that transition would unfold, and whether the cooperative fiction maintained throughout these years would survive the more fundamental transition that Hatshepsut's eventual death would inevitably bring to Egypt's unusual dual kingship. Chapter 13: The Quiet Years. Every reign eventually enters a phase where the great defining projects have already been accomplished, and what remains is the steadier work of maintenance and gradual accumulation. Hatshepsut's later years followed exactly this pattern, moving away from the dramatic undertakings that had characterized the middle portion of her rule. The temple at Deir el-Bahari stood complete. The obelisks at Karnak had been raised and inscribed. The expedition to Punt had returned its treasures years earlier, and the myrrh trees planted in her temple gardens had presumably taken root and grown. What followed was less a decline than a shift in emphasis, toward consolidation rather than fresh, spectacular achievement. Administrative records from this later period, fragmentary as they are, suggest a kingdom continuing to function smoothly under the systems Hatshepsut and her officials had established over the preceding years. Tax collection along the Nile continued according to established patterns, tied as always to the agricultural cycle that the annual flood governed so completely. Temple estates, expanded considerably through her earlier building program, required ongoing management to ensure their continued productivity and proper allocation of resources toward religious and royal purposes. This was unglamorous work, the kind that rarely generates dramatic inscriptions, but it represented the essential foundations supporting everything more visible that her reign had accomplished. Senenmut's presence in the historical record grows somewhat murkier during these later years, a pattern that has fueled considerable speculation among historians studying this period. Some inscriptions bearing his name and titles appear to date from this later phase of Hatshepsut's reign, suggesting his influence continued largely intact. Other evidence, including apparent damage to some of his monuments, has led certain scholars to propose that his standing may have declined before Hatshepsut's own death occurred. The uncertainty here reflects the broader challenge of reconstructing court politics from monuments that were rarely commissioned to record anything other than success and continued favor. Trade relationships established earlier in Hatshepsut's reign appear to have continued functioning during these quieter years, maintaining the economic prosperity that had characterized much of her rule. There is no strong evidence of a major new expedition comparable in scale to the celebrated journey to Punt, suggesting that the kingdom's foreign commercial relationships had settled into steadier, less dramatically documented patterns of exchange. This steadiness itself represented a kind of achievement, since maintaining established trade relationships required ongoing diplomatic attention even without the fanfare that accompanied a single spectacular new venture. Building activity did not cease entirely during this later period, though it appears to have shifted towards smaller scale additions and completions rather than entirely new, monumental undertakings. Some scholars point to evidence of continued work at various temple sites throughout Egypt, projects that lacked the scale of Deir el-Bahari or the Karnak obelisks, but still represented meaningful investment in the kingdom's religious infrastructure. This pattern makes sense for a reign entering its later phase, when the most ambitious projects had already been completed and remaining resources could be directed toward refinement and expansion of existing sacred spaces. Thutmose III's role within the kingdom's governance appears to have continued its gradual expansion during these years, building on the increasing visibility and military experience that earlier chapters have already discussed. Some historians propose that he may have taken on genuine independent responsibility for certain military or administrative functions during this later period, even while Hatshepsut retained overall seniority within their shared kingship. This gradual transfer of practical responsibility, if it did occur as some evidence suggests, would have represented a sensible preparation for the eventual transition that both rulers must have understood was approaching, however far off it may have seemed at any given moment. Health and aging represent difficult subjects to reconstruct with confidence from ancient Egyptian evidence, since inscriptions rarely addressed such personal matters directly. Hatshepsut had likely reached her 50s by the later years of her reign, an age that, while not extraordinarily old by modern standards, represented a substantial lifespan within the context of ancient Egyptian mortality patterns. Whatever her physical condition during these final years, the administrative machinery she had built continued functioning without evident disruption, suggesting that even if her personal energy had diminished somewhat, the systems of governance she had established proved resilient enough to continue operating effectively. Modern analysis of Hatshepsut's mummy, tentatively identified among unlabeled remains discovered in the Valley of the Kings, has provided some insight into her physical condition, though these findings remain subject to ongoing scholarly debate regarding certainty of identification. Evidence suggests she may have suffered from diabetes, a condition that would have posed serious health challenges without the medical interventions available in later eras. Bone cancer has also been proposed based on skeletal evidence, along with other health complications that would have made her later years physically difficult, regardless of her continued political authority. These findings, if accurately connected to Hatshepsut specifically, paint a picture of a ruler managing significant physical suffering, even while maintaining her position at the center of Egyptian governance. Court life during these years would have needed to accommodate whatever physical limitations Hatshepsut's declining health imposed, without necessarily disrupting the broader appearance of stable, effective royal authority that official inscriptions continued to project. Officials accustomed to her decisive leadership over the preceding decades likely adapted their expectations and working relationships as circumstances required. This kind of gradual accommodation, common in any long-running government facing a ruler's eventual decline, rarely generates the kind of dramatic record that historians might wish for, leaving considerable uncertainty about exactly how these later years actually unfolded within the palace itself. Neferure's fate during this period presents one of the more puzzling gaps in the historical record surrounding Hatshepsut's reign. Prominent in inscriptions and monuments during earlier years, evidence of her continued presence becomes noticeably sparser as the reign progressed into its later phase. Some historians propose that she may have died relatively young before her mother's own death occurred, though direct evidence confirming this theory remains frustratingly limited. If accurate, the loss of her daughter would have represented a significant personal blow to Hatshepsut during these already physically challenging final years of her rule. The broader question of succession planning during this period deserves careful consideration, since Hatshepsut's own mortality must have become an increasingly pressing concern as her health apparently declined. Thutmose III's position as heir to full sole kingship appears never to have been seriously questioned during these years, regardless of whatever practical power-sharing arrangement had structured their co-regency. This continuity of succession expectation suggests that whatever tensions may have existed between the two rulers, both understood and accepted the eventual transfer of complete authority to the younger king once circumstances required it. Religious observance continued throughout this later period according to established patterns, with Hatshepsut maintaining her participation in temple ritual dedicated to a moon for as long as her health permitted such activity. This continued religious engagement mattered enormously for maintaining the theological legitimacy she had spent years constructing, since any apparent abandonment of these duties might have raised uncomfortable questions about her fitness to continue holding the throne. Priests and officials would have worked to accommodate whatever adjustments her declining health required, while preserving the outward appearance of consistent, capable royal participation in the kingdom's sacred obligations. Foreign affairs during these quieter years appear to have remained largely stable, without evidence of major crisis or military challenge requiring urgent royal attention. This stability, whether attributable to skillful ongoing diplomacy or simply favorable circumstances beyond Egyptian control, allowed the kingdom to weather Hatshepsut's declining health without the added complication of external threat. A ruler managing serious illness while simultaneously confronting foreign invasion or rebellion would have faced circumstances far more dangerous than the relatively calm conditions that seem to have prevailed during this final phase of her reign. The administrative class Hatshepsut had cultivated throughout her reign, including officials whose careers she had personally advanced, likely provided crucial stability during these years of declining royal health. Men who owed their positions and prosperity to her patronage had strong incentives to ensure continued smooth governance, regardless of whatever personal challenges their patron faced. This kind of institutional resilience, built through years of careful cultivation of loyal, competent administrators, represents one of the less visible but genuinely significant achievements of Hatshepsut's broader approach to governance throughout her reign. Looking back on this period from the vantage point of subsequent history, these quieter years lack the dramatic narrative appeal of the divine birth story, the Punt expedition, or the towering obelisks that had defined earlier phases of Hatshepsut's reign. Yet they represent something equally significant about her rule: the capacity to sustain effective governance across an extended period, even as the ruler herself faced the physical challenges that eventually confront every human life, regardless of divine claims or political achievement. The systems she had built continued functioning, the kingdom remained stable, and the transition that everyone must have known was approaching had not yet arrived to test whether her achievements would survive her own passing. By the time these later years drew toward their inevitable conclusion, Hatshepsut had reigned as king of Egypt for close to 2 decades, an extraordinary span for any ruler, and particularly remarkable given the unprecedented nature of her claim to that position. Whatever physical suffering her final years involved, whatever uncertainty surrounded her daughter's fate, and whatever quiet adjustments in the balance of power with Thutmose III had occurred, the kingdom she had governed remained fundamentally intact. What approached now was the final chapter of her personal story, the end that comes to every reign eventually, and the uncertain question of exactly what would follow once her voice no longer guided the government she had built with such evident care. Chapter 14: The Last Days. Every account of a life eventually arrives at its ending, and Hatshepsut's story is no exception, however extraordinary the decades that preceded this final chapter. She died sometime around 1458 BCE, in what most chronological reconstructions place as her 22nd regnal year, following a reign that had transformed Egypt's architecture, expanded its trade networks, and redefined what a woman might achieve within the rigid structures of ancient kingship. The precise circumstances surrounding her death remain, even after decades of modern archaeological and medical investigation, a subject that historians continue to debate rather than settle with complete confidence. Identifying her actual remains presented Egyptologists with a genuine puzzle that took years of careful investigation to resolve, at least to the satisfaction of most scholars working on the question. Her original tomb, prepared earlier in her reign, did not contain her mummy when excavators eventually explored it in the early 20th century. This absence reflects a broader pattern of tomb robbery and mummy relocation that affected many royal burials throughout Egyptian history, as ancient priests moved bodies to protect them from looters, sometimes separating remains from their original burial equipment in the process. A body eventually identified as likely belonging to Hatshepsut was discovered in a comparatively modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV60, where it had lain largely unexamined for decades after its initial discovery. This mummy shared the tomb with another set of remains, believed to be those of a royal nurse named Sitri-In, who had cared for Hatshepsut during her lifetime. The presence of 2 bodies in one relatively small tomb puzzled early investigators, who did not immediately recognize the historical significance of either set of remains. Modern forensic techniques eventually provided the crucial evidence needed to identify these remains with greater confidence than earlier, more superficial examination had allowed. A tooth, discovered separately in a box bearing Hatshepsut's name among other funerary items, was matched to a gap in the jaw of one of the KV60 mummies through careful dental analysis conducted in the early 21st century. This match, while not providing absolute certainty, offered the strongest evidence available connecting these specific remains to the historical figure whose reign had reshaped Egypt centuries earlier. Examination of this identified mummy revealed a woman who had likely suffered from significant health problems in her later years, consistent with the physical decline suggested by other evidence discussed in the previous chapter. Diabetes appears among the conditions proposed by researchers studying the remains, based on evidence including obesity and other indicators consistent with this diagnosis. Bone cancer has also been suggested, along with dental problems that would have caused considerable pain and discomfort during her final years of life. The question of exactly what caused her death cannot be answered with complete certainty given the limitations of evidence available after more than 3,000 years, though various theories have been proposed by researchers studying her remains. Some have suggested that complications related to diabetes may have proven fatal, a condition that ancient medicine possessed no effective treatment for regardless of the patient's royal status. Others point to the possibility of cancer, potentially connected to bone or other tissue, as a contributing factor in her decline and eventual death. The precise combination of factors that ended her life likely involved multiple simultaneous health challenges rather than a single, clearly identifiable cause. Popular theories from earlier decades of Egyptological research sometimes proposed more dramatic explanations for her death, including speculation about poisoning orchestrated by Thutmose III, eager to claim sole authority over the kingdom. Modern medical examination of her remains has largely undermined this theory, finding evidence more consistent with natural illness and gradual physical decline than with sudden, deliberate poisoning. This shift in scholarly understanding reflects broader changes in how historians approach the relationship between Hatshepsut and her nephew, moving away from assumptions of dramatic personal conflict toward more measured assessment of available evidence. Preparation of her body following death would have followed the elaborate mummification rituals reserved for Egyptian royalty, a process that typically extended across several weeks and involved careful removal and preservation of internal organs, alongside treatment of the body itself with natron and other preservative substances. Priests trained in these specialized techniques would have overseen every stage of this process, ensuring that proper ritual accompanied each step toward preparing her body for its journey into the afterlife. This elaborate preparation reflected the same religious seriousness that had characterized her approach to kingship throughout her reign. Her original tomb, designated KV-20, had been prepared specifically for her use and represented an ambitious architectural undertaking in its own right, extending unusually deep into the limestone bedrock of the Valley of the Kings. This tomb also contained a sarcophagus originally prepared for her father, Thutmose I, suggesting that Hatshepsut intended for both herself and her father to eventually rest together within this same burial complex. This detail offers a poignant glimpse into how she understood her own legacy, connecting herself permanently to the father whose reign had established the foundation for everything she later achieved. The eventual fate of this original tomb and its contents remains somewhat unclear, complicated by the later campaign against her memory that subsequent chapters will examine in detail. Some evidence suggests her body may have initially been placed here following her death, before later circumstances led to its relocation to the more modest KV-60 tomb where it was eventually rediscovered. The reasons behind any such relocation remain speculative, though ancient Egyptian priests are known to have moved royal mummies periodically throughout history, often in response to tomb robbery or political circumstances affecting how a particular ruler's memory was being treated. News of Hatshepsut's death would have triggered the kingdom's established mourning rituals, a period of formal grief that Egyptian tradition prescribed for the passing of a reigning monarch. Temples throughout Egypt would have observed appropriate ceremonies, and the machinery of government would have begun the formal transition toward acknowledging Thutmose III as sole ruler of the kingdom he had shared, at least in name, with his aunt for nearly 2 decades. This transition, unlike some royal successions throughout history, did not require resolving any contested claim to the throne, since Thutmose III's position as heir had never been seriously questioned during the co-regency itself. The immediate aftermath of her death appears to have proceeded without the kind of visible crisis or upheaval that sometimes accompanied royal transitions in other periods of Egyptian history. Thutmose III assumed sole authority over the kingdom smoothly enough that surviving records show no evidence of significant disruption to governmental functioning during this period. This smooth transition suggests that whatever private feelings existed regarding the unusual co-regency arrangement, the practical machinery of Egyptian governance had been prepared adequately for this eventual shift in authority. What Thutmose III actually felt upon finally assuming complete, unshared control over the kingdom he had nominally ruled since childhood remains entirely unknowable from surviving evidence, a limitation that has not stopped considerable speculation among historians and popular writers alike. Some imagine relief at finally exercising authority long overdue. Others suggest possible resentment toward the woman who had overshadowed him for so many years of his life. The historical record itself remains frustratingly silent on this question, offering only the observable actions he took in subsequent years as indirect evidence of his true feelings. Egypt, at the moment of Hatshepsut's death, stood as a kingdom transformed considerably from what it had been decades earlier under her father's more militaristic reign. Temples had multiplied and expanded throughout Thebes and beyond. Trade networks reached distant lands like Punt, bringing exotic goods that enriched both the treasury and the religious life of the kingdom. Administrative systems functioned smoothly, supported by officials whose careers she had personally cultivated over years of patient investment in competent, loyal governance. This achievement, substantial as it clearly was by any objective measure, faced an uncertain future the moment Hatshepsut's voice fell silent and her body began its journey through the mummification process toward eventual burial. Thutmose III now held complete authority over the kingdom his aunt had shaped so thoroughly during her unprecedented reign. What he would choose to do with that authority, particularly regarding the physical and textual legacy his aunt had left scattered across Egypt's monuments and temples, remained to be seen in the years that followed her death. The full scope of what came next would unfold gradually, not through any immediate dramatic reversal, but through a more calculated campaign that later Egyptologists would spend considerable effort reconstructing and understanding. Hatshepsut had spent her reign building an elaborate permanent case for her own legitimacy, carved into stone across some of Egypt's most significant religious sites. Whether that carefully constructed legacy would survive intact, or whether it would face deliberate erasure at the hands of the very nephew whose throne she had once shared, remained the central question awaiting resolution in the years following her death. Chapter 15: Erased and Remembered. Thutmose III ruled alone for many years following his aunt's death, building the kind of military reputation that would eventually earn him comparison to history's greatest conquerors. His campaigns pushed Egyptian influence deeper into the Levant than any previous king had managed, including the famous Battle of Megiddo that later historians would study as a masterwork of ancient tactics. This was, in every sense, the reign of a warrior king, one whose priorities and achievements looked considerably different from the building-focused, trade-oriented rule his aunt had pursued. Yet somewhere within this reign of undeniable military triumph, a quieter campaign was also unfolding, one aimed not at foreign enemies, but at the memory of the woman who had ruled Egypt before him. Sometime late in his reign, evidence suggests, Thutmose III ordered a systematic effort to remove Hatshepsut's name and image from many of the monuments she had commissioned throughout her lifetime. Her cartouches were chiseled away from temple walls, her statues were damaged or removed from public display, and her name was excised from official king lists that recorded the succession of Egyptian rulers across generations. This was not a hasty or careless act carried out by a single angry decree. It represented a deliberate, extensive undertaking that must have required considerable time, labor, and administrative coordination to execute across the many sites where her monuments stood. The scale of this erasure campaign becomes apparent when examining specific sites connected to Hatshepsut's reign, particularly her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Images of her performing rituals, receiving divine blessing, and claiming the regalia of kingship were systematically attacked, sometimes replaced with images of Thutmose III or III instead, effectively rewriting the temple's decorative program to suggest that Hatshepsut had never ruled at all. This substitution strategy proved particularly significant for later historians, since it initially obscured the true extent of her reign and delayed proper scholarly recognition of her achievements by many decades after the temple's rediscovery. Her obelisks at Karnak received somewhat different treatment, reflecting perhaps the practical challenge of destroying such massive, deeply embedded monuments compared to the relative ease of damaging wall reliefs or statues. Rather than attempting outright destruction, Thutmose III ordered a wall constructed around the base of at least one obelisk, obscuring its inscriptions from view without physically demolishing the monument itself. This approach suggests a campaign focused on erasing visible memory and active veneration, rather than pursuing total physical destruction of everything Hatshepsut had built during her reign. Historians have proposed several competing explanations for why Thutmose III pursued this campaign, none of which can be confirmed with absolute certainty given the limitations of surviving evidence. One theory suggests personal resentment, built up over decades of subordinate status during their shared co-regency, finally finding expression once he held unchallenged authority. Another proposes a more pragmatic political motivation, aimed at eliminating any precedent that might encourage future challenges to conventional male succession within the dynasty. A third explanation focuses on securing his own son's succession, potentially erasing Hatshepsut's memory to strengthen the direct line of legitimacy running through male heirs alone. The timing of this erasure campaign offers some clues relevant to evaluating these competing theories, though the evidence remains frustratingly open to multiple interpretations. Rather than beginning immediately after Hatshepsut's death, when personal resentment might be expected to manifest most acutely, the campaign appears to have intensified later in his reign, possibly connected to preparations for his own son's eventual succession. This timing has led many modern historians to favor political calculation over personal vendetta as the primary motivation, viewing the erasure as strategic rather than purely emotional in its origins. Not every trace of Hatshepsut's reign fell victim to this campaign, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of total, successful erasure. Some monuments escape significant damage, whether through oversight, practical difficulty of access, or simply the sheer scale of the undertaking exceeding what could be completely accomplished. The myrrh tree pits at Deir el-Bahari remained undisturbed, and certain inscriptions elsewhere survived largely intact. This incomplete execution would eventually prove crucial for modern historians attempting to reconstruct her actual achievements once scholarly attention finally turned toward this neglected chapter of Egyptian history. Egypt's official king lists compiled centuries after these events reflect the apparent success of at least part of this erasure campaign, generally omitting Hatshepsut entirely from the sequence of legitimate rulers. Ancient sources like the Turin King List and later compilations produced by Manetho, a Greco-Egyptian historian writing centuries afterward, show gaps or irregularities in this period that modern scholars now understand as reflecting her deliberately erased reign. This absence from formal historical memory meant that for millennia, Hatshepsut's remarkable achievements remained essentially invisible to anyone relying solely on these official chronological records. Modern rediscovery of Hatshepsut's true significance began in earnest during the 19th century, as European Egyptologists started seriously studying and translating the hieroglyphic inscriptions covering temples throughout Egypt. Jean-François Champollion, whose decipherment of hieroglyphics had opened Egyptian history to genuine scholarly investigation, encountered evidence of a female pharaoh during his examination of Deir el-Bahari, though the fragmentary and damaged nature of the evidence initially created considerable confusion. Early interpretations struggled to reconcile the female pronouns and titles appearing alongside clearly royal, masculine regalia and imagery. Subsequent decades of careful archaeological and textual research gradually clarified the true nature of Hatshepsut's reign, piecing together fragments scattered across multiple sites into a coherent picture of her extraordinary political achievement. Scholars began recognizing the divine birth narrative, the Punt expedition reliefs, and the various building projects as belonging to a single, remarkable historical figure rather than representing confused or contradictory evidence about multiple different rulers. This reconstruction process extended across generations of Egyptological scholarship, with each new discovery adding further detail to the emerging portrait of her reign. The identification of her mummy in the early 21st century, discussed in the previous chapter, represented perhaps the culminating achievement of this long process of historical rediscovery. Modern medical technology, unavailable to earlier generations of scholars, finally provided physical evidence connecting a specific set of human remains to this remarkable historical figure whose achievements had been deliberately obscured for over 3,000 years. This identification transformed Hatshepsut from a somewhat abstract historical puzzle into a genuine human being whose physical body could finally be studied and, in a sense, properly honored after millennia of neglect. Contemporary historians now generally recognize Hatshepsut as one of the most successful and significant rulers of Egypt's 18th dynasty, a judgment that would have seemed impossible to reach based solely on the official king lists that Thutmose III's erasure campaign had helped shape. Her building achievements at Deir el-Bahari and Karnak are studied as architectural masterworks in their own right, independent of whatever political controversy surrounded her original claim to kingship. Her trade expedition to Punt remains one of the most vividly documented commercial ventures in ancient Egyptian history, offering rare ethnographic detail about a distant land that few other sources describe in comparable richness. Scholarly assessment of her reign has evolved considerably since those early confused 19th century encounters with the fragmentary evidence at Deir el-Bahari. Early 20th century historians sometimes framed her as a scheming, illegitimate usurper who had stolen power from the rightful king, reflecting perhaps as much about the gender assumptions of those historians' own era as about genuine historical evidence. More recent scholarship has moved toward a more balanced assessment, recognizing both the unprecedented nature of her achievement and the genuine administrative and cultural accomplishments that characterized her actual governance of Egypt. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III continues generating scholarly discussion and popular fascination, precisely because the available evidence permits multiple, sometimes contradictory interpretations of their true dynamic. Was theirs a relationship of genuine cooperation, gradually souring only after her death for reasons unrelated to any earlier conflict? Or did resentment simmer beneath the cooperative surface throughout their shared reign, finally erupting once he held unchallenged authority? The honest answer, based on surviving evidence, is that certainty remains elusive and likely will remain so barring some remarkable future archaeological discovery that definitively resolves these lingering questions. What can be stated with confidence is that Hatshepsut's reign represented something genuinely unprecedented within Egyptian history, a woman who navigated the constraints of her society's rigid gender expectations to claim and exercise the full authority of kingship for roughly 2 decades. She built temples that still stand today, drawing visitors and scholars alike more than 3,000 years after her death. She organized trade expeditions that expanded Egypt's connections to distant lands, and she maintained peaceful, prosperous governance during a period when her kingdom could easily have descended into the kind of succession crisis that had troubled previous generations of her own family. The erasure campaign that followed her death, whatever its true motivation, ultimately failed in its apparent goal of removing her permanently from historical memory. Stone proved more durable than the political calculations of any single reign, and enough evidence survived, scattered across temples and tombs throughout Egypt, for modern scholarship to eventually reconstruct the truth of what she had accomplished. Hatshepsut's name, once deliberately chiseled from monument after monument, is once again spoken by historians, students, and visitors who walk through the temple she built into the cliffs of western Thebes, more than 3 millennia after someone tried to ensure it would be forgotten forever.